Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Forest Ghosts of Washington State. The air felt different as I stepped off the bus at the edge of the national park in Washington. It was crisp, cooler than I'd expected for late autumn, and the scent of pine filled my lungs, sharp and earthy. I had always heard that the forests here were legendary, lush, untouched, vast, and brimming with life. But as I looked up at the towering trees, their branches barely swaying in the still air, something in my gut twisted uncomfortably. It wasn't fear, exactly. Just an odd sensation that something was waiting, watching. I shrugged off the feeling, telling myself it was just nerves. I wasn't unfamiliar with hiking trips, but this was my first time in the Pacific Northwest. I had planned this solo getaway for months, an opportunity to escape the noise of the city, clear my head, and get some fresh air. The bus had dropped me off at the trailhead, where only a few other hikers were milling about, their backpacks slung over their shoulders as they prepared for the same journey I had ahead. The park rangers had given me a map and a brief rundown of the trail conditions when I checked in. A simple 3-hour hike through the woods, they'd said, and I'd be back in time for dinner. No big deal. I had the day all to myself, and I couldn't wait to lose myself in the quiet. At the start of the trail, the path was wide and clearly marked, winding its way through a forest that felt ancient, as though it had been there long before any human had set foot. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their trunks gnarled with age. The ground beneath me was soft, a mixture of fallen needles and thick moss, cushioning my every step. Everything felt peaceful, almost serene. But as I moved deeper into the woods, the feeling in my chest only grew heavier. It wasn't just the quiet that bothered me, it was how absolute it was. The sound of birds chirping, the rustling of leaves in the wind, it all seemed to stop after a while. I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was holding its breath. There was no wind, no distant call of wildlife, nothing. Just the echo of my boots crunching against the forest floor. I paused for a moment, looking around. The trees here were so thick that even daylight had trouble piercing through the canopy above. It was like walking through a dream, one that I couldn't quite control. My senses were on high alert, but when I glanced over my shoulder, there was nothing unusual, just the shadows of trees stretching out behind me. I took a deep breath, trying to clear my mind. Just keep moving, I muttered to myself, it's just the newness of the place, that's all. But as I pressed on, the silence seemed to press in tighter. My heart quickened, and despite myself, I felt the first stirrings of unease. Was it just the isolation? Or something else? As I walked, I noticed that the trail began to narrow, the path becoming less distinct, more overgrown. The trees seemed to grow closer together, their dark, moss-covered trunks encroaching on the path, casting long, sharp shadows. For a moment, I wondered if I had taken a wrong turn. I pulled up the map to check, but everything seemed to match up. There was no sound but the crunch of my footsteps. I pushed forward, the feeling of being watched growing steadily. And then, I heard it. A rustling sound. At first, it was distant, far off in the trees. But then it grew louder, moving closer. I stopped and turned my head sharply to the side, but the forest was still. My heart raced a little faster now, the feeling of something moving just beyond my line of sight creeping up my spine. I told myself it was nothing. Probably an animal, I reasoned. Maybe a deer or a bird rustling through the underbrush. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, the air felt wrong. Thick. Too still. And there was a sense of dread I couldn't shake. A sudden gust of wind swept through the trees, breaking the unnatural silence. For a moment, I felt a bit of relief, as though the forest was simply breathing again. But it was fleeting. The wind died just as quickly as it had come, leaving me with a growing sense of unease. I continued on, my eyes darting between the trees, my nerves on edge. The deeper I went into the forest, the more oppressive the silence became. It felt like the trees themselves were closing in around me, blocking out any trace of the outside world. The occasional rustling from the wind seemed hollow, unnatural, like a distant whisper. Then, a flicker caught my eye, a shadow moving between the trunks of the trees. I blinked, trying to make sense of it, but when I turned my head, there was nothing. Just the same old forest. I shook my head. Maybe I was imagining things. It had been a long trip, and the isolation of the forest was beginning to play tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I checked my watch, still a long way to go. A few more hours, and I'd be back at the trailhead. But something told me it wouldn't be that simple. The trail was becoming harder to follow as I moved deeper into the forest. The path was choked with thick roots and low-hanging branches that scraped at my clothes, the ground uneven and soft beneath my feet. I had to pay close attention to where I stepped, lest I trip over the twisted roots or hidden rocks. Despite the difficulty, there was a strange, hypnotic quality to the rhythm of my steps, the way the forest seemed to envelop me with every stride I took. The isolation felt almost comforting, like I was wrapped in a quiet cocoon far from the world. But then, that rustling noise started again. It was faint at first, barely more than a whisper in the leaves, but it was steady, purposeful. A soft, scratchy sound that seemed to come from somewhere just off the trail. I paused, frozen for a moment, listening intently. It was almost like someone, or something, was moving just beyond the trees, brushing against the bark or rustling through the underbrush. I turned, but there was nothing. Only shadows and a dappled light filtering through the canopy. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a squirrel or a bird, but there was something about it that didn't quite fit. The rustling wasn't random. It was too deliberate. Almost like someone was walking in the same direction I was, just out of sight, keeping pace with me. I quickened my pace, trying to shake the feeling, but the rustling followed, as if it were mimicking my movements. I stopped again, listening. The forest was still, the sounds of wildlife eerily absent. No chirping birds, no scurrying animals, nothing. Just the rustling, louder now. Closer. My breath caught in my throat. I forced myself to keep walking, telling myself it was nothing, but the sensation of being watched only deepened. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and every step I took seemed to echo louder in my ears, as if the forest itself were amplifying my presence. I could feel eyes on me, even though there was no one around. I glanced behind me, but the trail stretched out, empty and silent. The trees stood tall and unmoving, their shadows stretching long and dark in the slanted light. Then it came again, the rustling. Closer this time. A step. Another. The sound of something brushing against leaves, the unmistakable sound of movement just at the edge of my hearing. I spun around quickly, my pulse hammering in my chest, but again, there was nothing. No figure, no animal, nothing but the silent forest. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, just out of sight, following me. Watching. I forced myself to keep moving, but my thoughts began to race. What if it wasn't an animal? What if someone else was out here, too? It didn't make sense, though. I was far off the main trail, miles away from any marked campsites or cabins. The park wasn't heavily trafficked this time of year. But the rustling didn't stop. It was constant now, rhythmically matching my own steps, as if someone or something was walking in the shadows just behind me. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe it was a hiker, just a bit further off the path. A lost camper or someone who had taken a wrong turn. The thought should have comforted me, but it didn't. I tried to ignore it, pushing myself forward, but every rustling leaf, every broken twig felt like it was coming from right behind me. The deeper I went, the more suffocating the silence felt. The sounds of the forest, the calls of birds, the distant hum of insects had disappeared completely. It was just me and that constant, unnerving rustle. Then, without warning, I heard a voice. It was faint at first, more like a whisper carried by the wind, but it was unmistakable. A voice. Low. Muffled. Just barely audible, like it was coming from deep within the woods. I froze again, my blood running cold. The voice wasn't in any language I recognized. It wasn't even a full sentence, just a strange, fragmented noise that felt wrong in the air. My heart began to race as I looked around, feeling the weight of the forest pressing down on me. The rustling had stopped, but the voice lingered, curling into my thoughts. I shook my head. No, I was imagining things. My mind was playing tricks on me. The forest was just dense, strange sounds echoed from deep within it, and my tired mind was stretching every little thing into something more than it was. I started walking faster, my breath coming quicker, trying to outrun whatever it was that was following me. But the voice came again, a little louder this time. I couldn't understand it, but it felt closer, almost like it was calling my name. Keep moving, I whispered to myself. You're just hearing things. But deep down, I knew I wasn't alone. And I couldn't shake the feeling that something was getting closer. Something that wasn't quite human. Something that had been waiting for me in the woods all along. I took another step, and the whisper echoed through my mind again. I kept moving, faster now, my thoughts racing to rationalize everything, distractions, exhaustion, the odd quiet of the woods. My chest tightened with each step, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep going. It wasn't until I noticed something odd in the underbrush that I finally slowed. Something gleamed in the muted light, half buried under a patch of moss and fallen leaves. My eyes immediately went to it, drawn by the glint. At first, I thought it was a discarded bottle or a broken piece of plastic, but as I knelt down to get a closer look, I realized it was an old camera. It didn't make any sense. Why would a camera be out here, deep in the woods, hidden like this? The leather casing was weathered and worn, the edges frayed from years of neglect. The lens was cloudy, as if it had been exposed to the elements for far too long. Yet, there it was, lying untouched in the underbrush, as if waiting for me. I reached for it slowly, a chill creeping up my spine. Something about the camera seemed familiar. Not in a way that I could explain, but in a way that stirred something inside me. A sensation I couldn't quite place. The moment my fingers brushed against it, I felt an odd pull, almost magnetic. It was as though the camera wanted me to take it. What am I doing? I shook my head and hesitated for a moment, glancing around at the dense forest. No one could have left this here recently. There were no other hikers around, no sign of anyone else. Having been on this part of the trail, the camera had clearly been here a long time, but why was it buried so carefully, almost as if someone had left it for me to find? I picked it up, the weight of it strange in my hand, colder than I expected. I turned it over in my palm, studying the vintage design. It was one of those old film cameras, the kind you don't see much anymore. It wasn't just the age that unsettled me, it was the way it felt, like it was meant to be in my hands. I shivered involuntarily. A strange urge rose within me. I wanted to take it with me. I didn't know why. I couldn't explain it. Maybe it was the mystery of it, the sudden connection I felt. Maybe it was the need for something tangible in the midst of this strange place. But the thought of leaving it behind felt wrong. Something would be lost if I did. I shoved the camera into my backpack, trying to ignore the tightness in my chest, the little voice in my head telling me to leave it, to walk away from whatever pulled it out of me. But I didn't. I couldn't. I needed it. The rustling from earlier was gone now, but the tension in the air was thicker than ever. I tried to push the feeling down, bury it with a forced calm, but every time my fingers brushed the edge of my pack, where the camera rested, that same pull, the same uneasy sense of connection, pressed against my skin. The feeling grew stronger as I walked, as if the camera were silently calling to me. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just an abandoned object. It was something else. Something that had been left here for a reason. But for the life of me, I couldn't understand why I felt so strongly about it. The forest seemed to close in around me again, the trees pressing closer with each step. The path had narrowed further, and I noticed that the ground was becoming uneven, the terrain shifting from soft moss to loose dirt and jagged rocks. It was harder to walk now, and I was beginning to realize just how isolated I had become. The silence weighed heavier with every step, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something or someone just out of sight. The sense of being followed hadn't gone away. I stopped, trying to steady myself. My hands were shaking, but I couldn't tell if it was from the cold or something else, something deeper. Then I heard it again. That whispering voice. Low and distant, but unmistakable. It was like a hum in the air, just beyond hearing. The rustling, too. Soft but persistent. Something moving between the trees, close enough to make my skin crawl. I turned around quickly, but again, there was nothing. Just the forest, stretching in every direction. For a moment, I stood there, frozen, staring into the trees, the weight of the camera pulling at my shoulders. I couldn't help but wonder what it had seen, what it had been through. I shuddered at the thought, then snapped back to the present. There was no time for distractions. I had to finish the hike, get to the end of the trail, and get back to safety. But as I resumed walking, the sense of being watched, the feeling that the forest was alive with unseen eyes, grew unbearable. The camera seemed heavier now, as if it were dragging me deeper into the woods. I couldn't stop myself from glancing at it again. Something was wrong with it. But what? Why couldn't I just leave it behind? The deeper I ventured into the forest, the more oppressive the silence became. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the way the forest seemed to absorb everything. My own footsteps, once rhythmic and sure, now sounded muffled, like the earth itself was trying to swallow them up. There was no wind, no distant bird call, no rustling of leaves. Just that suffocating stillness, thick and unnerving. I kept my eyes fixed on the path ahead, willing myself to focus, but it was impossible to ignore the creeping sense of being watched. The feeling had intensified since I'd found the camera. Every so often, I would glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing just behind me. But each time, the forest was empty, silent, and still. Except, there was something at the edges of my vision. It started subtly, just a flicker of movement between the trees, as if the shadows themselves were shifting. At first, I thought it was my imagination. The woods were thick with shadows, after all, and the light was low, casting strange shapes against the trunks of the trees. But the flickers didn't stop. They came and went, always at the periphery of my sight, always just beyond my line of vision. I paused and squinted into the undergrowth. The trees ahead of me looked wrong. The shadows, long and distorted, twisted unnaturally around the trunks, as if the branches themselves were reaching out, curling toward me. My breath hitched, and I took a step back, unwilling to take my eyes off the shapes in the distance. Then it happened again, a figure moving between the trees. Tall, thin, and impossibly still. It was more like a shadow than a person, but it was unmistakably human in shape. I blinked, and it was gone. I shook my head and started walking faster, my heart pounding in my chest. I was starting to lose my grip on reality. I had to. This place, this forest, was messing with my mind. But no matter how fast I moved, the presence seemed to follow me. Every time I glanced away, I saw something, another flicker at the edge of my vision. It was like being stalked by shadows, always moving just out of reach. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was just tired, maybe the isolation was starting to get to me. But then I heard it, the whisper. A soft, low murmur, as faint as the wind. The sound came from behind me, but it didn't feel like it was carried by the breeze. It felt like the air itself had changed, thickened with something that wasn't supposed to be there. My skin prickled, and I turned around quickly, but once again, the forest was empty. I stood there for a moment, frozen. The air felt so still, it was suffocating. The trees, once towering and majestic, now seemed to loom over me, their branches twisting in unnatural ways, like fingers stretching toward me from the shadows. I took another step, then stopped. The whisper came again, clearer this time. It wasn't words, just a sound, an exhale, like someone breathing directly into my ear. I spun around so quickly that I nearly lost my balance, but there was nothing. No one. Just the deep, endless quiet of the forest. And then, a soft rustling sound came from somewhere behind me, too close, too deliberate. My heart skipped a beat as I spun on my heel, searching the darkening woods for any sign of movement. But again, there was nothing. The trail behind me was empty, just the fading remnants of the path leading back the way I came. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Someone, or something, was here, with me. The presence, whatever it was right there, hovering just out of view, waiting. Watching. I quickened my pace, adrenaline flooding my system, but the more I tried to distance myself from it, the closer it seemed to get. Each time I glanced over my shoulder, I saw more movement. More shadows. More flickers of figures at the edges of my sight, just out of reach. It was like they were closing in, encircling me, stalking me through the trees. My breath came in shallow gasps, but the oppressive air wouldn't let me exhale fully. Then it came again, another whisper. This time, I could almost make out words, though they were too garbled to understand. The sound made my blood run cold. I stumbled forward, my mind spiraling. What were they saying? Was it a warning? A threat? The words danced on the edge of my understanding, teasing me, but always slipping away the moment I tried to grasp them. I kept moving, faster now, as if running would break the spell of whatever was following me. But the trees were beginning to look different. The trunk seemed to bend inward, narrowing the path, closing off any escape. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, and the rustling grew louder, more deliberate. I froze mid-step. There was no breeze, no rustling leaves, but the air seemed to hum with a low, vibrating energy like the world itself was holding its breath. The forest had become a living thing, watching me, listening to me. I could feel its presence all around, pressing in from all sides. And that's when I saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the trees. It was almost indistinguishable from the shadows around it, but I could see the shape clearly, tall, gaunt, its limbs too long, its body too still. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its gaze, fixed on me, piercing through the darkness. The whispering grew louder now, a chorus of voices all around me, but I couldn't make out any of the words. It was as if the figure itself was speaking directly into my mind, pulling me toward it. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But my body wouldn't move. I was frozen, caught in its gaze, the air thick with the weight of its presence. And then everything went silent. My breath came out in uneven gasps, the forest closing in around me, the shadows growing deeper and more oppressive with each passing second. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something ancient and malicious hiding in the trees, waiting to pounce. But despite the growing fear gnawing at my insides, I couldn't stop moving forward. The thought of being stuck in the forest, unable to leave, was worse than anything else. I reached for the camera, my fingers trembling as I fumbled with the strap, pulling it out from the depths of my backpack. It felt cold against my palm, heavier now, as if the weight of what it contained had increased somehow, as if the very act of holding it had become a sinister ritual. I didn't know why, but the urge to take a photo was overwhelming. The shadows, the figures, the whispers, I needed something, anything, to prove I wasn't losing my mind. Maybe it would help to see things more clearly. Maybe the camera, in its eerie stillness, could capture whatever it was I was sensing. Maybe that would make it all real. I lifted the camera to my eye and clicked the shutter without thinking. The sound was oddly loud in the silence, like a gunshot echoing through the woods. I stared at the viewfinder, expecting to see just a blur of dark trees and thick underbrush. But something else was there, something I hadn't noticed before. A figure. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a distortion in the lens, but no. I brought the camera down, the eerie weight of it settling heavily in my hands. My heart began to race. I needed to see it more clearly. I pulled the camera closer, twisting the lens to focus, and my stomach dropped. The figure in the photograph wasn't just a shadow. It was something darker, something impossible, standing just beyond the trees. Tall, impossibly thin, its limbs unnaturally long, reaching out like crooked branches. Its face was featureless, just a blur of shadow that seemed to shift and move the longer I looked at it. I blinked, but it remained, frozen in the frame. I felt my pulse quicken, a creeping fear crawling under my skin. The shadow wasn't just in the photo, it was in the forest too. Was it still out there? Watching me? I turned slowly, scanning the trees around me, but the forest was empty. Silent. The whispering had stopped, but the presence, it was still there. The oppressive weight of it pressing against my chest, wrapping around my throat, choking the air from my lungs. I forced myself to take a shaky breath, my hands trembling so badly now that I almost dropped the camera. I tried to tell myself it was just the light playing tricks, a trick of the mind. The figure in the photo, it could just be a shadow from the trees, right? Maybe a blur in the lens. Maybe I was too tired. Maybe the exhaustion was starting to catch up with me. But deep down, I knew better. There was no mistaking it. The figure in the photo was real. It was something else. Something not meant to be there. I turned and began walking faster, my heart pounding in my ears. The forest felt smaller now, the trees closing in on me, as if the very landscape itself were shifting. The shadows seemed to stretch toward me, pulling me in, and I could feel something moving just out of reach, always there, just beyond my line of sight. I reached into my bag and pulled the camera out again, my fingers moving almost automatically. My thumb hovered over the shutter button, and I snapped another photo, hoping to prove it was all just a figment of my imagination. A bad idea, a blur, a trick of the lens. But when I lowered the camera and checked the image, I felt my stomach twist into knots. There, in the photo, was the figure again. And this time, it was closer. It wasn't just a shadow at the edge of the trees anymore, it was standing right there, in the open, right in the middle of the frame, its long arms reaching toward the camera. It wasn't just a shadow. It was alive. My breath caught in my throat. Panic set in. The urge to run was overpowering, but I couldn't move. My feet were frozen to the ground, my body refusing to obey the frantic call of my mind to escape. I was rooted to the spot, helpless, trapped in the gaze of something I couldn't explain. Then the whispering started again, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. It was a low murmur, a chorus of voices, all distorted and garbled. I couldn't make out any words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a beckoning, a call. I couldn't look at the photo any longer. My hands shook so violently now that the camera almost slipped from my grip, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. The figure in the frame, it was watching me. I was sure of it. I could feel its eyes on me, burning through the lens, pulling me into its world, a world that wasn't supposed to be here, not in this forest. I turned and ran. My legs carried me forward, faster than I thought possible, but the trees seemed to close in tighter, the shadows twisting and writhing as if they were alive, reaching for me. The rustling behind me began again, close, too close. Something moving, fast, just out of sight. The photo. The camera. It was all part of it. The forest was alive, and whatever had been lurking in the shadows had found me. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it, the figure, standing there at the edge of the trees, its limbs stretching, reaching. Its eyes, or whatever they were, burning into me through the lens of the camera. The whispering was still in my head, faint but persistent, like a nagging voice I couldn't shake. I kept telling myself that I had to stay calm, that I was overreacting, that I had just imagined it all. But that feeling, the feeling of being watched, never left. It was like a weight pressing down on my chest, heavy and suffocating, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, it wouldn't go away. I stared at the camera in my hand, its black surface reflecting the dim light of my flashlight. What had I been thinking, taking those photos? I should have just left it behind when I found it, should have left the strange, old thing buried under the leaves where I'd found it. But something had drawn me to it. Something that felt almost predatory. Like it wanted to be found. I shifted uncomfortably on the cold ground, trying to push the unsettling thoughts away. I needed to stay rational. There was an explanation for all of this. It was just a trick of the light, I told myself. Maybe some odd reflection or distortion of shadows. The trees here were dense, the canopy thick. Of course, there would be strange patterns in the dark. My mind was playing tricks on me. I was tired. I was exhausted from the hike. The isolation of the woods, the strange quiet, it was all messing with me. I gripped the camera tightly, the smooth, cold plastic offering me no comfort. If I kept thinking about it, about the figure in the photo, I would lose my grip on reality. I had to let it go. I needed to focus on getting back to civilization, back to a place where I could get some rest. I had seen enough of the forest. Enough of this strange feeling of being hunted. I'd had my fill of the woods. But even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't true. I couldn't leave. I couldn't go back. I didn't know why, but something inside me, some instinct, was telling me to keep moving forward, to stay. I could hear the voice, soft in my mind, urging me to go deeper into the woods. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and I fought the overwhelming urge to look over my shoulder, to check every shadow for movement. I tried to focus on the path in front of me. The forest seemed less menacing in the daylight, even though I knew the shadows still lurked just beyond the trees. My rational mind kept telling me it was all in my head, but the unease in my gut wouldn't go away. I took another step, then another. The rustling noise had returned, faint at first, like the breeze pushing through the underbrush. But I could hear it growing louder now, sharper, more deliberate. It was coming from behind me, somewhere in the thick darkness just beyond the reach of the path. I turned quickly, my breath catching in my throat, but the forest remained still. Nothing moved. Just the trees, towering over me, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. I laughed, quiet, but shaky. "It's nothing," I muttered to myself, forcing my voice to steady. "Just the wind." But even as I spoke, I knew it wasn't the wind. The air had a strange, unnatural stillness to it, like everything was holding its breath. Like the trees, the earth, the sky were waiting for something. A shadow shifted in the corner of my vision, and I snapped my head toward it. There, between the trunks of two massive cedars, was something. Something dark, too dark, moving just at the edge of the forest, barely visible. I blinked, and it was gone. No. It was just my mind again. I was losing myself in paranoia, in my own fear. It was easy to believe in the supernatural out here, in the depths of the forest, where everything felt so alien. But I was smarter than that. I was a logical person, a person who believed in facts and evidence. I wouldn't let myself be swallowed up by my fears. I needed to get back to the car. I needed to call for help. This wasn't right. The woods weren't just off. There was something wrong with them. With this place. But the moment I started thinking about leaving, a feeling, a cold, nauseating feeling, settled over me. It was like the very thought of leaving was forbidden, like the forest would never let me go once I acknowledged how badly I wanted to escape. I couldn't explain it, but I knew it. My body was revolting against the idea of turning back. I couldn't leave. I couldn't go. But I had to. I had to get out. I had to find a way back to safety. The rustling came again, louder now, but it wasn't just leaves. It was closer, more distinct. Footsteps. The sound of something walking. Someone walking. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was no one there. Nothing but the silent, waiting trees. The feeling of eyes on me, that feeling was stronger than ever now. The shadows were watching. I could feel them pressing in from all sides, creeping closer. The oppressive weight of their gaze was suffocating. I snapped my head around again, but no matter how quickly I looked, the forest stayed still. Empty. Silent. I couldn't shake the thought, it wasn't just my mind. Something was out there. Something was here. I should have kept walking. I should have kept moving forward, put the camera down, and never looked back. But the forest was closing in, pulling me deeper into its grip, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being led somewhere. Somewhere I didn't want to go. I forced myself to breathe, to focus on putting one foot in front of the other, but the whispers, they were getting louder, more distinct. At first, I thought it was the wind again, or maybe the shifting of the trees. The sound was subtle, a faint murmur I could almost ignore. But the longer I walked, the clearer it became. Low voices, overlapping, whispering in the darkness, just out of reach, just beyond the boundaries of the forest that surrounded me. It was as if they were coming from all around me, swirling in the air, carried on the breeze, but always just out of reach. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of the words, but they were fragmented, disjointed, like half-formed thoughts tumbling through my mind. A sentence, a name, a plea, it was all jumbled, distorted. But it was unmistakable. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't alone. The whispers seemed to grow louder the further I walked, and the closer they got, the more frantic they sounded. They tugged at my consciousness, trying to break through the fog of my thoughts. They wanted something. Needed something. Don't leave, come closer. I froze. The voice, one voice in the sea of whispers, sounded almost familiar. I couldn't place it at first, but something about the tone, it felt like it was meant for me. It didn't sound like anything I had heard before, but it carried a deep, unsettling pull, like the air thickened around me with each word. I shook my head violently, trying to push the sound away, but it was impossible. I could feel it, a presence in the air, weaving itself around me like smoke, thick and suffocating. Come back, closer. The voice grew more insistent, more urgent, but still indistinct. My hands clenched into fists, and my heartbeat quickened. I was becoming panicked, desperate to understand what was happening. I took a step back, then another, my eyes darting around the trees, scanning the dark corners where the shadows pooled. Please, come, now. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't just the wind. This wasn't the forest playing tricks on me. No, this was something else. Something was trying to communicate, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to hear it. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, to break free from whatever this was. But as I moved, the whispers followed me, circling my thoughts, sinking into the spaces I didn't want to explore. They were growing louder, more insistent, like a chorus of voices that had always been there, waiting. And then it happened. Amidst the dissonant hum of voices, a single word cut through the others with chilling clarity, sharp and undeniable. My name. James. I froze, my body locking up at the sound of it. No one had spoken that word for years, not like this. It wasn't a whisper. It was a call. A voice so clear, so personal, it felt like someone was standing right behind me, breathing down my neck. I spun around, my heart slamming against my ribs, but there was no one. No one but the oppressive silence of the forest. The trees. The shadows. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, the cold air of the woods pressing against me like a weight. The whispers had gone quiet for a moment, but the silence was even worse. It was too quiet. Too still. I wasn't alone. James. The voice, the whisper, rang in my ears again, clear as day. This time, it wasn't a call from behind me, it was in my mind. Inside my head. The chill that ran down my spine wasn't just from the cold. It was something else. Something far colder. I stumbled back, tripping over a root hidden beneath the underbrush, and barely caught myself before falling. My hands pressed against the damp ground, the soil cold against my skin, and I pulled myself upright, feeling disoriented. The whispers hadn't stopped. They were everywhere now, louder than ever, pressing in on me from all directions. The air felt thick, dense, as though it were closing in. The trees seemed to sway in time with the voices, their branches twisting and groaning as if they, too, were alive. I shook my head again, desperately trying to banish the words, but they clung to me, lingering like a curse. The forest was alive with them, the voices twisting and calling out my name as if the very woods themselves were calling me home. I didn't want to listen. I didn't want to hear them, but I couldn't help it. The voice was inescapable. Come back. James. Come to us. A shiver ran through me, my entire body trembling, and my vision blurred for a moment. The woods, the trees, they seemed to shift around me, their shadows stretching longer, their dark forms bending and moving like something more than just nature. I didn't know how long I stood there, lost in the whispers, my head spinning. Everything inside me screamed to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed by the sound of my name being repeated over and over, calling me into the dark. I took a shallow breath, then another, trying to steady myself, but the words wouldn't stop. The forest wouldn't stop calling. And deep inside, something within me was beginning to listen. The sky was fading into a deep, bruised purple as I set up camp. The forest, once calming in its serene quiet, now felt different. It felt alive in a way that unsettled me. The shadows between the trees stretched long and dark, and the stillness was so thick it felt suffocating. I tried to push the fear away, telling myself that I was overreacting. I was here to rest, to enjoy the quiet, to disconnect. That's what I had come here for, wasn't it? But with every passing minute, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. Something was waiting. I glanced nervously over my shoulder, but the only thing I saw was the dense forest, its shadows flickering at the edges of my vision. Nothing moved, nothing stirred. The fire crackled, snapping and popping as I set up the small tent. The orange glow from the flames flickered across the trees, casting long, shifting shadows that seemed to writhe and dance with a mind of their own. I swallowed hard and forced myself to focus on the task at hand, tying the ropes and staking down the tent pegs. I couldn't let my imagination run wild. Still, something tugged at the edge of my thoughts. The rustling in the bushes hadn't stopped since I had arrived, that soft, almost imperceptible movement just beyond the fire's light. It was as if the forest itself was alive with sound, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. I tried to convince myself that it was just the wind or small animals. Deer. Squirrels. Anything but what my gut told me it was. But deep down, I knew it wasn't animals. The movements were too deliberate, too calculated. They didn't sound like the occasional rustling of wildlife. It was something else, something larger, something that seemed to circle me. I sat down by the fire, my back to the warmth, and listened. The flickering of the flames made everything feel surreal, almost dreamlike. The crackling, the whispering of the wind through the trees, the rustling. It was all beginning to blend together, becoming one unending noise that gnawed at my mind. Snap. The sound came from just beyond the firelight, somewhere in the bushes. It was too loud to be a small animal, too purposeful. I felt my heart skip a beat. I didn't move. My breath caught in my throat. I could feel my body tense, instinctively bracing for something to appear. Another snap. Then, more rustling. Something was moving out there. Not a breeze, not the wind, but something, someone. I slowly turned my head, trying not to make a sound. My eyes scanned the dark outlines of the trees, the flickering shadows from the fire creating distorted shapes in the forest. I could feel it again, that sensation of being watched, that deep, unsettling weight pressing down on me. Every movement, every shift in the dark, every whisper in the wind seemed to pull my attention. I should have called out. I should have shouted, asked who was there, but I didn't. My throat felt tight and my mouth dry. My eyes darted around, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever it was before it could see me. Rustle. A figure emerged from the shadows, so faint I almost missed it. I couldn't make out any details, but I saw the outline, a silhouette of something moving just inside the tree line. It was too tall to be a deer. Too solid to be a shadow. The form seemed to stretch unnaturally, like a reflection in a broken mirror, jagged and incomplete. I didn't dare blink. My heart was hammering in my chest, every instinct telling me to run, to grab my things and leave, but my legs were frozen. My eyes were locked on that spot, where the figure had been. But now, nothing. The shadows had swallowed it whole. I let out a shaky breath, unsure of whether I had actually seen it or if it was my imagination playing tricks on me. I couldn't be sure anymore. The line between reality and nightmare was blurring. Snap. Another sound, this time much closer, from the edge of the camp. I turned sharply, my breath catching in my throat, but I saw nothing. The rustling was back, louder now. It circled the perimeter of the camp, growing closer with every passing second. Whoever, or whatever, was out there was circling me. Watching me. Waiting for something. I reached for the flashlight, my fingers trembling as I fumbled with the switch. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, the underbrush, the shadows, but nothing. No one. The rustling continued, only now it was accompanied by something else. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper that came from deep within the forest. It sounded like more than one voice. They were speaking in hushed tones, too faint for me to make out, but it was there, drifting on the wind, circling me, closing in. The air felt colder suddenly. I could see my breath in the light of the fire, and it wasn't from the temperature, it was the fear that had settled in my bones. James. It was faint, but there. The voice calling me again. The voice I couldn't escape. I whipped my head around, but there was nothing. The forest was silent again, too silent. Even the wind had stopped, the rustling, the whispers, everything. It was as though the forest had gone still, as if it was holding its breath. James. The voice was clearer now, unmistakable, coming from just beyond the camp. But when I tried to move, my body wouldn't respond. The air had thickened, weighed down with something dark and oppressive. My feet were rooted to the ground, as though the very earth itself was holding me in place. I was paralyzed by fear, and for a long moment, I couldn't breathe. I didn't know what to do. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shape moving quickly at the edge of the firelight. It was fast, too fast for a human, its movements jerky and unnatural, like something not meant to be seen. I couldn't stay here. I had to run. But I couldn't move. The whispers, the shadow, the eyes, everything in me screamed to escape, but something in the forest was keeping me there. Come closer, James. I felt it then. Something was there, just beyond the light, just out of sight. And it was waiting for me. I hadn't meant to go deeper into the forest. In fact, every instinct inside me screamed to turn back, to leave the eerie silence behind and return to civilization. But something had a hold on me. The forest, its whispers, the shadows, they were pulling me in, urging me to move deeper, to explore more, as if I was being guided towards something. I couldn't explain it. There was no rational reason for continuing. But I walked on, my footsteps tentative, careful, the weight of the unknown pressing against my chest with each step. I wasn't sure how long I had been walking when I first noticed the change. The trees seemed denser, their trunks thicker, their branches twisting in ways that felt unnatural, as though the forest itself had been warped. The quiet had grown deeper, the whispers now replaced by an oppressive silence. Not even the wind moved the leaves anymore. Then, I saw it, a clearing up ahead, barely visible through the thick fog that had rolled in. The moment I stepped into it, I knew something was wrong. The first thing that caught my eye was the hiking boot. Half buried in the dirt, its leather scuffed and worn, it was the kind of boot I had seen countless times on other hikers, rugged, durable, meant to withstand the harsh terrain. But what made it different was the way it lay there, abandoned, half covered by fallen leaves and branches, as if it had been tossed aside in a hurry. I stepped closer, my heart beginning to race. My eyes darted around the clearing, and that's when I saw the other items, a torn backpack, a water bottle still half full, a map folded up neatly but slightly crumpled. None of it made sense. Whoever had been here, they had left in a hurry. Something had caused them to abandon everything. A chill ran down my spine as I crouched to examine the abandoned items. I gingerly touched the backpack, as though fearing it might unravel the moment I made contact. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication of what had happened to the hiker. But then, I noticed something strange. A small journal, its leather cover stained with dirt, lay wedged beneath the pack. The pages were sticking together, but I managed to pry it open to the first few entries. The handwriting was erratic, frantic. Day 1, beautiful here. The air is so fresh, the trees towering above me like silent giants. I feel at peace in the forest, surrounded by its ancient presence. Day 2, something's off. The whispers are louder now. I thought I heard someone calling my name, but no one is around. It's just me, alone in the woods. But I can't shake this feeling. Day 3, I'm not alone. I can feel them watching me. I saw someone in the trees, just a shadow, but it was there. I know it was. They're waiting for me. I'm not safe here. I need to leave, but the path, it keeps changing. I can't find my way back. I closed the journal with trembling hands, the last entry still echoing in my mind. They're waiting for me. The words sent a shudder through me, deep into my bones. I looked around the clearing again, feeling a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. The sense of being watched was suffocating now, thicker than ever before. I stood up, glancing over the items again. A cold wind picked up, rustling the leaves and carrying with it a faint whisper that sent my heart into overdrive. Leave now, before they come. I whipped around, the voice not from the journal but from somewhere deep in the forest. It felt like a warning. I needed to get out of there. I shouldn't have stayed as long as I had. But as I turned to head back, my foot caught on something hidden beneath the dirt. I stumbled, barely catching myself before falling face first into the ground. My breath hitched as I saw what had tripped me, a human bone, pale and stark against the brown earth. A rib, cracked and weathered, as though it had been lying there for years. A scream caught in my throat, but I didn't let it out. I couldn't. My mind raced with 1,000 questions, all of them too horrific to voice. But one thing was clear, I wasn't alone here. And I was nowhere near safe. I quickly stood and backed away, my eyes darting frantically around the clearing. I couldn't leave fast enough. Every step away from the bone, from the journal, from the lost hiker, was a step into a deeper, darker abyss that I was certain I would never escape. I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest knew I was there, that it was aware of my presence. The air was thick with unseen eyes, watching, waiting. The shadows shifted as if alive. I could feel them in the corners of my vision, just beyond the reach of the light, moving like something out of a nightmare. As I turned to leave, I heard something I hadn't expected, footsteps, slow and deliberate, behind me. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. I didn't dare turn around. I didn't have to. I knew who or what it was. It was coming for me. Without a second thought, I ran, my breath ragged and my legs trembling beneath me. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees pressing tighter together, their branches stretching down like dark hands, trying to pull me back into the depths of the woods. The clearing faded behind me, but the sense of being followed, of being hunted, didn't leave. It never did. I ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but the weight of my own fear was pulling me back, like invisible hands gripping at my ankles. Every step was harder than the last, every movement slower, as though the very forest itself was conspiring to keep me here. The rustling in the underbrush had grown louder, more persistent, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer with each passing moment. It was as though the darkness itself was alive, moving, circling, waiting. I didn't dare look back. My eyes were locked ahead, scanning the trees for any sign of an exit. But the forest, it seemed endless. I could feel it closing in around me, pushing me further into its depths, where the light from the sky seemed to disappear entirely. The path I had come from was already fading into the oppressive blackness behind me, and with every frantic step I took, the sounds of the forest grew quieter, more muffled, like I was being swallowed whole. Then, through the trees, I saw it. A flicker of movement, a pale shape, standing motionless between the trunks. It was there, just beyond the reach of the dim light from my flashlight, standing in a clearing I hadn't noticed before. The figure was impossibly still, as if it were part of the forest itself. It was too distant for me to make out any details at first, but even from here, I could tell it was no animal. No human either. The figure was pale, ghostly, almost translucent, as though it were a wisp of smoke caught in the trees. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a hesitant step closer, unwilling to take my eyes off it, though every instinct in my body screamed for me to turn and run. What was that? I thought. What am I seeing? It was hard to focus. The shadows danced around it, distorting the edges of the figure, making it harder to discern if it was real or simply another trick of the forest. But there it was, standing unnervingly still, its outline a sickly pale contrast against the thick, dark trees. It wasn't a person, at least not in any way I understood. Its limbs were too long, too thin, and its face was blurred, as though it were trying to hide from my sight. I blinked once, twice, then froze in place, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was gone. I stood there for a moment, too terrified to move, staring at the spot where it had been. The forest was completely still again, as though nothing had happened, as though I had imagined it. I couldn't be sure anymore. My mind was beginning to betray me, spinning stories in the dark corners of my thoughts. Was it real? Did I actually see it? No, I couldn't have. It was just my mind playing tricks. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to clear the thoughts clouding my brain. I opened them again, trying to convince myself it was just a fleeting vision, a trick of the light, something to explain away. But deep down, I knew something had changed. I felt different now. The forest no longer felt like a place I could escape from. It felt like a trap, closing in on me with every second I stood there. The whispers were back, louder now, but just out of reach. The air was thick, charged with an unnatural stillness. The trees seemed to loom over me, their branches stretching like fingers, reaching for me, pulling me deeper into the dark heart of the forest. A wave of dizziness hit me suddenly, the ground beneath me feeling unsteady, as if the earth itself were shifting. I stumbled, my vision blurring, and for a moment, I thought I might fall. I tried to steady myself, but my legs felt like lead. The darkness was pressing against me, suffocating, making it harder to breathe. Then, once again, I heard it, a faint rustling in the distance, barely audible, but distinct. I turned my head toward the sound, my pulse quickening, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The sound grew closer, a series of footsteps, slow, deliberate, yet never quite in sync with my own. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't anything I could explain. And then, through the trees ahead of me, I saw it again. The pale figure, standing motionless, staring at me with its empty, faceless gaze. It was closer this time. Much closer. Too close. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It was as if the very sight of it paralyzed me. My legs locked in place, frozen by the cold terror that spread through me like ice. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished once more, melting into the shadows as if it had never been there. I was alone again. Or was I? The whispers were louder now, and I realized they weren't whispers at all. They were voices. Many voices, speaking in hushed tones, murmuring to one another just beyond the veil of the trees. They were so faint I couldn't understand them, but their cadence was unmistakable. A constant, creeping hum that seemed to resonate from all around me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I couldn't. The fear had paralyzed me. I was surrounded. Trapped. The feeling of being watched had never been so strong. The eyes of the forest were on me. And whatever that figure was, whatever it had been, wasn't done with me yet. I turned away, my pulse racing, and started to walk faster, then break into a run, the sounds of my footsteps echoing in the silence, now the only thing that seemed real. But deep in my gut, I knew the truth. I wasn't alone. And no matter how far I ran, I was never getting out of this forest. The woods felt colder now. Each breath I took seemed to fog the air, as though the forest itself was exhaling a chill that sank into my bones. Every step I took felt heavier, like the earth was pressing back against me, as if it didn't want me to leave, didn't want me to escape. The shadows seemed to stretch further, wrapping around me, pulling at the edges of my vision. The trees had become more oppressive, their gnarled branches like arms reaching down, scraping the sky in frustration. I had to understand what was happening. I had to know what was real and what was my mind unraveling. The figure I had seen, pale, faceless, impossible, was still burned into my mind, as vivid as the moment I first saw it. And there was something else too, something nagging at the edges of my thoughts. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The whispers, the shapes, the cold, they were real, and they were watching me. I couldn't just keep running. I couldn't keep denying what I had seen. I needed answers. So, I started following the shadows. At first, it was a hesitant step, one foot forward, then the other, my eyes scanning the trees in the dimming light, desperately trying to catch a glimpse of whatever it was that had been haunting me. I told myself it was just the wind, or my imagination, playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I wasn't alone. There, just ahead of me, between the trees, a flicker. A pale shape, like smoke or fog, drifting from one shadow to another. It wasn't moving like a human, not with the slow, deliberate pace of a person, but with the fluid, unnatural grace of something that shouldn't exist. It moved with purpose, but it was always just out of reach. I followed it. At first, it was easy to convince myself it was just a shadow cast by the trees or a trick of the light. But with every passing moment, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, the sense of something lurking just beyond my vision, waiting for me to slip. I tried to focus, to make sense of the figure, but the more I followed, the harder it became to see clearly. The forest seemed to shift, the trees bending, the path blurring in and out of focus. A gust of wind whipped through the branches, sending the leaves scattering in every direction. And then, in the chaos of movement, I saw it again, closer this time. The pale figure. It was standing still, as though waiting for me, just beyond the reach of my flashlight's beam. My heart skipped a beat as I stumbled forward, every muscle in my body urging me to stop, to turn back, to run. But I didn't. I was too far gone. I took a shaky step closer, the hairs on the back of my neck rising as the silence pressed down around me. My breath felt too loud in the stillness, each exhale more ragged than the last. I wanted to call out, to demand answers, but I couldn't find my voice. It was like I was trapped in a dream, my body moving without my consent, my thoughts scrambling for some kind of meaning, some explanation that would make sense of this nightmare. But the figure didn't move. I blinked, and in that fleeting moment, it was gone. What the hell is happening? The panic bubbled up inside me, a cold, unrelenting tide that made my hands shake and my chest tighten. I should have stopped. I should have run. But something kept me rooted to the spot. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the place where the figure had been. My thoughts swirled around it like a vortex, each one more tangled than the last. And then it hit me, I wasn't alone. I turned sharply, heart hammering in my chest, expecting to see another figure behind me, but there was nothing. Only the trees. The wind had died, leaving a suffocating quiet in its wake. I wasn't sure what I had expected, but the emptiness around me was worse than anything I had seen so far. That's when I heard it. A soft, almost inaudible rustle, coming from somewhere just beyond the trees. It was faint, but it was there, unmistakable. Someone, or something, was out there, watching me. I moved toward the sound, driven by some need I couldn't explain. The rustling became clearer, more distinct, like the shifting of footsteps through leaves. But when I looked again, there was no one there. Nothing but the endless darkness of the forest. "Where are you?" I thought, my voice a silent plea. "What do you want from me?" I moved forward, my pulse quickening with each step. The shadows around me seemed to deepen, the trees growing thicker, their twisted branches like clawed hands reaching down from the sky. The air was still now, heavy with something I couldn't name. The weight of it pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I tried to focus, to push through the fog of fear clouding my mind, but it was as though the forest itself was closing in. I had followed the figure too far. The rustling stopped. Everything stopped. The silence was suffocating, too perfect, too complete. I stopped walking, my heart in my throat. The cold feeling of eyes on me returned, more intense than ever. It was as though the forest had suddenly become aware of my presence, as though it were waiting for me to make my next move. "Get out of here." But I didn't move. My feet were glued to the spot, my mind locked in a trance, unsure whether to fight or flee. And then, without warning, a flash of movement, just a glimpse, a pale blur darting between the trees. A shape, no, two shapes, closer now, moving too fast for me to make out details. I followed them, my legs moving on their own, driven by something deeper than logic. The figures moved like smoke, flowing between the trees with a grace that felt unnatural, too fluid to be real. I couldn't catch them, but I couldn't stop myself from chasing them either. I was running now, my breath ragged and uneven, the forest closing in around me. The whispers were back, louder, like a chorus of voices rising all around me. I couldn't understand them, but I could feel their words, a warning, a beckoning. The figures stopped. They were still. And then I saw them clearly for the first time, pale, gaunt faces staring at me from between the trees, their eyes empty, their bodies so thin they barely seemed to exist at all. I froze, my heart in my throat, paralyzed by the sight. They weren't human. Not anymore. The forest had claimed them. And it was coming for me next. I had been running, but now I was frozen. The world around me had fallen into a thick, suffocating silence. The wind, which had howled through the trees only moments before, had stopped completely. The rustling leaves, the creaking of the branches, even the distant calls of birds, all of it had ceased. In its place was a heavy stillness, as though the forest itself had held its breath. I felt it then, the unnaturalness of the quiet. It wasn't just a lull. It was as if the forest had been holding something back, something far darker than I could comprehend. The air had grown thick with tension, charged like static electricity before a storm. Every small sound, every shift of my foot against the ground, every shallow breath I took seemed amplified, as though the forest was listening, waiting for me to make a mistake. My heart was thudding in my chest, each beat seeming to echo in the silence. I swallowed, the sound of my own throat clicking against my dry mouth somehow louder than I remembered. The sound of my feet crunching over the forest floor felt like a drumbeat, sharp and unnatural, like it was mocking me. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy, like it was resisting my will, as though the forest itself were trying to stop me from leaving. I glanced around, every shadow seeming to stretch longer and grow darker. The trees, normally towering and reassuring, now looked like looming giants, their gnarled branches twisting in ways that made them look less like nature and more like something else. The way they reached down, their twisted limbs clawing at the sky, made the whole forest seem like a trap, a place where I didn't belong. The silence grew unbearable, and with it, my paranoia deepened. Every crack of a twig underfoot felt like a warning. Every shift of the underbrush made my heart leap into my throat. But the most unsettling thing of all? I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was just beyond my sight, watching me from the shadows. I'd heard it before, that feeling of eyes on me. But now it was louder, more insistent, crawling under my skin like insects, making the hairs on the back of my neck prickle with dread. I tried to breathe slowly, to calm myself, but the stillness was making it harder. My breath sounded too loud, too frantic, breaking the oppressive silence in harsh, staccato bursts. The world seemed to press in on me from all sides, the very air thick with something I couldn't explain. Every sound, no matter how small, seemed to carry with it a weight, a hidden meaning that made my stomach tighten. It's nothing, I told myself. It's all in your head. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The silence was too perfect, too unnatural. The forest had been alive with sounds before, with life. But now it felt like everything had been shut down, like something was waiting for the right moment to move. I took another step, the crunch of the leaves underfoot sounding far too loud. It made my chest tighten, like the forest was listening, waiting for me to slip. And then, from somewhere deeper in the woods, too faint to be certain, but unmistakable, I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound. A whisper. My body froze, my skin prickling. I strained to listen, but the whisper wasn't clear. It was like a voice, but distant, layered under the weight of the silence. It didn't feel like the wind, it was something else. Something deliberate. Who's there? I turned quickly, my flashlight flicking from side to side, but there was nothing. No movement. No shape in the darkness. The whisper had faded, lost among the shadows. But the silence that followed felt heavier now, as though it had deepened, thickened around me, pressing in on all sides. I could feel my pulse in my ears, could feel the blood rushing through my veins in loud, frantic beats. I swallowed, my mouth dry, and took another cautious step forward, trying to ignore the way the silence seemed to follow me. And then, another sound. This time, closer. The crunch of leaves. Slow. Deliberate. I froze again, eyes darting to the trees, the shadows. Was it another animal? My mind raced to rationalize it. The sound could be anything. It could be an animal. Or the wind shifting, playing tricks on my senses. But as I stood there, listening, it became clear it wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too careful. Someone, or something, was moving through the woods, moving towards me. My breath hitched. My eyes frantically searched the darkness, but there was no sign of movement, no shape to follow. Just the whisper of wind through the trees, soft, almost non-existent. It's just my mind, I tried to convince myself. Just my mind. But the unease was gnawing at me. The way the forest felt too still. The way every sound, no matter how small, seemed to make the world feel like it was closing in on me. It wasn't natural. It wasn't right. And then, again, the whisper. This time it was clearer. It came from somewhere directly in front of me, a voice low and soft, barely audible over the thrum of my own heartbeat. But it wasn't just one voice. It was multiple. Layered. I couldn't make out the words. But I knew they were speaking to me. Calling me. The sound was so close now, it felt like the voices were in my ear. My breath caught, my chest tightening. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't obey. The air was too thick, my limbs too heavy. And then I saw it. A flicker, a pale shape, just a movement at the edge of my vision. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest, flashlight flicking wildly as I searched the trees. There was nothing there. I was losing my mind. This couldn't be real. But as I stood there, trembling in the thick silence, I knew one thing with certainty: something was in the woods with me. And it wasn't going away. The forest had stopped making noise, but I could hear it now, the sound of my own fear. The deep, resonating hum of a place that wasn't just silent, but waiting for something to happen. Something I couldn't escape. I could feel it then, the quiet pressing in like a vice, trapping me in the forest, where the shadows were waiting to swallow me whole. I didn't know how much longer I could stand the silence. It felt like the forest was slowly suffocating me, every breath I took heavier than the last, every step deeper into some unseen abyss. The whispers continued to haunt me, always just beyond comprehension, but always there, a constant presence, as if the forest itself was alive with voices I couldn't reach. But then, something caught my eye, a faint glint of something shiny, half buried under the roots of a fallen log. My heart skipped, a mixture of dread and curiosity pulling me closer. It wasn't much, just a small object, half hidden in the dirt, but it felt important. The pull towards it was almost magnetic, a sensation I couldn't explain, a whisper in my mind telling me to look closer. My hands trembled as I knelt beside the log, the soil cold and damp beneath my fingers. I pushed aside the loose earth, my nails scraping against the bark and rocks, until I uncovered what was hidden. A small, leather-bound journal. It was weathered, the pages yellowed and brittle, the cover scuffed from years of exposure to the elements. I didn't know why, but I felt the need to open it. I wasn't sure if it was the whispers still ringing in my ears, or the strange feeling that I was meant to find this, that it was part of my path now, but I unlatched the journal and flipped it open. The first page was nearly illegible, faded ink blurring the words as though they had been smeared by time. But the rest of the pages, they were clearer, written in neat, cramped handwriting. At first, it seemed like any other journal. The musings of a hiker, perhaps someone lost in the beauty of the forest, writing down their thoughts for the day. But as I read, the words began to take on a darker tone. It's hard to describe what's been happening to us out here. The others say it's just nerves. But I know something's wrong. The forest doesn't feel right. It's like it's watching us. I read the passage again, my skin crawling. The words felt like a warning, the same sensation I'd been experiencing since I entered the woods. But this was from someone else, a hiker, like me, who had come to the forest and encountered the same strange feeling. I turned the page, eager to read more, but the further I read, the more the entries twisted into something else, something terrifying. We keep hearing voices in the trees. No matter how many times we call out, no one answers. It's getting harder to sleep. I thought I saw someone in the distance today, but when I looked again, there was no one. Just shadows. Voices. Shadows. I could feel my pulse quicken as I read on, my fingers trembling. This wasn't just a journal, it was a record of something that had happened to someone else, someone who had experienced the same eerie presence that I was beginning to feel all around me. They had heard the same whispers, seen the same shadows. I turned another page, hoping for some explanation, some hint of how they had escaped, how they had survived. But the next entry sent a chill through me that made my stomach twist in a knot. We found something today, something horrible. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't human. It looked like it had once been a person, but its skin was too pale, stretched thin, like it had been drained of life. I don't know how it got here, but but it was moving, watching us. I couldn't breathe. The words on the page blurred as I scanned them again, but it was clear. Whatever had happened to these hikers, whatever they had seen in the forest, it was too terrible for words. We tried to leave, but the path keeps changing. It's like the forest doesn't want us to go. Every time we try to make our way back to the trail, we end up somewhere else, somewhere worse. The trees, they're closing in on us. The journal entry ended abruptly after that. There were no more pages, no further explanation of what had happened to the hikers who had written this account. No words to tell me if they had made it out of the forest. But one thing was clear, they hadn't survived. I closed the journal, the weight of its contents heavy in my hands. My mind was racing, processing everything I had just read. The missing hikers, the shadowy figures, the whispers in the trees, it was all connected. This wasn't a coincidence. This was the forest's truth, and I had stumbled upon it. But what did it mean for me? I didn't know. But there was one thing I was sure of now. The forest had been claiming people for years. And I was no different. I stood up, my legs trembling beneath me, my mind spinning with the terrifying realization that I wasn't alone out here. This place, this forest, had a life of its own. A life that was hungry for something, and I didn't know how much longer I would be able to escape it. The air felt colder now, the whispers louder, pressing in from all sides. I turned away from the log, clutching the journal to my chest, unsure of where to go next. But as I moved, I noticed something. A small, strange mark on the page I hadn't seen before. The ink was dark and fresh, as if it had been written only moments ago. The forest is calling you. Don't run. You'll never escape. The words were a warning, yes, but also a command. And in that moment, I knew. The forest was never going to let me leave. I thought I knew where I was going. I had followed the trail into the woods, a well-worn path that hundreds of hikers had traveled before me. But now, as I stood in the thickening shadows of the forest, everything felt wrong. The trees, once familiar and comforting, now seemed to loom over me like silent sentinels, their twisted branches stretching out in every direction, blocking my path. I turned around, expecting to see the well-trodden trail I had been following, but all I saw were more trees, dense, tangled, a labyrinth that swallowed every trace of the path behind me. The forest had shifted. It was as if the ground itself had moved, rearranging everything in a way that made no sense. I couldn't see any signs of the trailhead, no markers, no footprints, nothing. A creeping panic crawled up my spine. I took a few steps back, searching for some familiar landmark, but the trees had closed in so tightly, I couldn't even see the sun anymore. The light had turned dim, the shadows growing longer and deeper. It was as though the forest had a mind of its own, closing in on me, bending the world around me until it was unrecognizable. I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded in my chest, the sounds of my own rapid breaths deafening in the stillness. I was trapped. The forest had swallowed me whole. And worse, I knew it wasn't by accident. I took a deep breath and tried to steady myself, but the silence felt oppressive, the air thick and heavy. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my compass, but it offered no comfort. The needle spun wildly, erratic, as though the forest itself was playing tricks on me. It couldn't be malfunctioning. No, this wasn't a mistake, it was deliberate. Think, I told myself. You're not lost. You're just disoriented. The trail's here somewhere. You can find it. But the longer I stood there, the more the trees seemed to shift and change. I glanced over my shoulder, then back to where I thought the path should have been, but nothing was the same. It felt like I was moving through a dream or a nightmare. The landscape was alive, breathing, twisting around me. It was impossible to stay oriented. Every direction felt wrong. Every step led me deeper into a forest that had no end. I started walking again, faster now, trying to force myself to move in a straight line, trying to outrun the fear that was beginning to gnaw at me. But the forest didn't let me go. It pulled me in. The trees stretched farther out in all directions, the ground beneath my feet uneven, as if the earth was shifting beneath me. I glanced up, trying to spot the sky, hoping to get some sense of direction. But all I saw was a dense canopy of dark leaves, blocking out the sky, cutting me off from everything. The air had grown thick with an almost unnatural stillness, and the weight of the silence was suffocating. The trees weren't just surrounding me, they were closing in, pulling together like a cage, a maze with no way out. I stopped, a chill creeping through my body. I felt it, they were watching me. I wasn't just lost in the forest. I was being herded. A low whisper, barely a sound, flickered through the air, just out of reach. The words were indecipherable, but I felt them. It wasn't just a voice, it was the presence of something old, something patient. The forest had been waiting for me, and now it was moving in on me. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. I was panicking. I needed to focus. But every time I tried to move forward, every time I tried to find my bearings, it was as if the trees moved with me. The path twisted back in on itself, looping in impossible directions. It was no longer a trail, it was a trap. The forest itself was alive, shifting and bending around me. I turned in a circle, trying to get a sense of the direction I'd come from. But it was useless. The world around me was a shifting puzzle I couldn't solve. Every step I took seemed to lead me further away from where I thought I should be, deeper into the shadows, into the thick, oppressive dark. No, this can't be happening. I'm just disoriented. This is all in my head. The forest is just big, it's just dense. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The forest had changed. It was deliberate. And there was something in it, something watching me. I could feel it, like a weight pressing down on me from all sides. I had to get out. I moved again, this time with more urgency. My legs were stiff, my body aching with each step, but I kept going. I wasn't sure where I was heading, but I couldn't just stand still. I had to keep moving. And then, as I stumbled through a thicket of trees, I saw something, a glimpse of movement. A figure, standing just out of sight, half hidden in the shadows. My breath caught in my throat. I froze, staring into the darkness, my eyes straining to make out the shape. It didn't move. It just stood there, still, watching. I took a shaky step forward, my body on high alert, the air around me thick with tension. Was it human? A hiker? Or was it something else? The shadows seemed to swallow it up, and for a moment, I wondered if it was even real, or if I had finally lost my mind. But then, as I blinked, the figure vanished. Gone, as if it had never been there. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, unsure if I had just seen a ghost, a trick of the light, or something far worse. The fear that gripped me now was cold, deep, and suffocating. I wasn't just lost. I wasn't just being watched. I was being hunted. The forest had trapped me. And it wasn't going to let me go. I kept moving, though I didn't know why. My mind screamed for me to stop, to turn back, but every time I tried, the trees would shift, bending in ways I couldn't understand, forcing me deeper into the unknown. The whispers had grown louder now, a chorus of voices that blended together, indistinguishable, like a cacophony of warnings, of threats, of something ancient and cruel lurking in the forest. I could feel them all around me. The eyes in the dark. Watching. Waiting. But then, there was movement. Not just in the periphery of my vision, but right in front of me. A shadow detached itself from the darkness of the trees, a figure standing just ahead, barely visible through the thickening fog of my panic. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, my body locking up as if it had forgotten how to move. It was like nothing I had ever seen. It wasn't human. The shape was wrong, its edges blurry, shifting, as if it were made of smoke or mist. Its form twisted and rippled with each movement, constantly changing, its outline breaking and reforming like something not meant for this world. The air around it seemed to grow colder, and the light itself bent away from its presence. But the most unsettling thing were its eyes. Dark. Hollow. No pupils, no light. Just endless, empty voids that seemed to swallow the surrounding darkness, pulling everything into them. There was no warmth to them, just an abyss, cold and cruel, like the deepest part of the ocean where light could never reach. I couldn't breathe. My heart was pounding so loud, I feared it would give me away, but the figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, its body swirling and shifting in unnatural patterns, its face barely visible beneath the waves of its own form. It was like it was made of the very shadows themselves, a creature born from the forest's darkness, and it was watching me. The whispers grew louder, like 1,000 voices crying out in pain, in warning. And then, as if the air itself shuddered with the sound, it spoke. Its voice was soft, almost gentle, but there was something jagged about it, something hollow and distant. It didn't sound human, it sounded like the wind passing through an abandoned house, the scraping of tree branches against the glass. You should have turned back. The words weren't loud, but they cut through me like a knife, a chill crawling up my spine. I tried to move, but my legs felt heavy, as if they were made of stone, unwilling to obey. The figure's eyes, those terrible, black eyes, locked onto mine, and I felt a weight, a pressure building in my chest, like I was drowning in the emptiness of those hollow orbs. You are not meant to be here, it whispered again, its voice like rustling leaves in a storm. This place is not yours. You will stay with us now. Forever. The words wrapped around me, pulling tighter, squeezing the breath from my lungs. I couldn't look away from those eyes. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, caught in the gaze of this thing, whatever it was. I didn't know if it was truly a ghost, a spirit, or something else entirely, but it didn't matter. It was here. And it was telling me I was trapped. The figure's form seemed to distort even further as it took a step toward me. The shadows around it deepened, swallowing the light, leaving me in a void of blackness that seemed to press against my skin. My mind screamed for me to run, to do something, anything, but my body refused to obey. I couldn't even bring myself to look away from those eyes. Stay calm, I thought. You have to stay calm. You've seen this before. It's just fear. It's just your mind. But I knew it wasn't just fear. This was real. And this thing, this creature in front of me, it wasn't letting me go. Another step forward, and the air grew colder still. I could feel the weight of the forest closing in around me, as if every branch, every leaf, every blade of grass was part of this creature's will, part of its reach. The darkness seemed to be alive, crawling toward me with a hunger I couldn't understand. "You will never leave," the figure whispered, its voice more like a sigh, like a promise. "Not now. Not ever." The ground beneath my feet seemed to tremble, the forest itself quivering with the energy of the thing before me. I could feel the space around me bending, warping, closing in. And then, in a final rush of terror, I broke free. I didn't know how. I don't know if it was sheer panic or some instinct buried deep within me, but I ran. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I didn't care if the forest was shifting or the shadows were following. I just ran. My legs carried me forward, even though I could hear the whispers growing louder in my ears, feel the figure following me, its presence still hanging over my shoulder like a death sentence. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. But even as I fled, I could hear the whispering voice in my mind, faint but clear. "You cannot escape." I ran until my lungs burned, my legs were like lead, and I felt my body on the verge of collapse. The forest stretched on, endless, a maze I couldn't find my way out of. And all the while, I knew the shadows were watching. They were waiting. And no matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I tried to get, I was still a part of the forest now. And it would never let me go. The forest was alive. Alive in a way that no forest should be. I could feel it with every step, every breath I took, the weight of something ancient and cruel pressing on me from all sides. The trees whispered as the wind moved through their leaves, but it wasn't the usual forest sound. It was something different. Something personal. The air had turned thick and suffocating, and every crackling twig or rustling leaf felt like the forest was closing in on me, one slow, deliberate inch at a time. I thought I had escaped. I thought I had outrun the creature, the shadow, the ghost, whatever it was, but I knew better now. The whispers had not stopped. They had only grown louder, more insistent. The silence that had once felt so oppressively thick had now turned to a hum, a pulse that vibrated through the ground and into my bones. And no matter where I went, no matter how many turns I made, I kept sensing it. They were still following me. At first, it was just a feeling. A presence lurking just behind me, out of sight, but ever there, like a predator watching its prey. But as I kept moving, as I pushed deeper into the heart of the forest, it became harder and harder to ignore. It wasn't just in my head anymore. There were noises, small, soft at first, like the occasional branch cracking or the sound of footsteps just beyond my reach. Every time I paused, trying to listen for a familiar sound, there would be another noise, quicker, closer this time, then silence. I wasn't alone. The trees closed in tighter, their trunks thicker and more twisted the further I went, their branches reaching out like fingers, pulling me deeper into their tangled web. The canopy above blocked out the light, turning the forest floor into a shadowy labyrinth. I couldn't see the sky anymore. I couldn't even hear the normal forest sounds, the birds, the wind. Only the whispering, the soft shifting of something that moved just at the edges of my vision, teasing me, keeping me on edge. I stumbled through the underbrush, my legs aching, my mind desperate for some sense of direction, but the forest was toying with me. Every step forward felt like 2 steps back. The trees seemed to shift around me, their trunks leaning in as if they were closing off any path I might have had. I turned a corner, expecting to find some sign of civilization, a trail, a marker, but there was nothing. Only the same endless stretch of trees, the same oppressive darkness. My breath came in short gasps, my heart hammering against my ribs. I was losing it. I knew I was. The fear was clouding my thoughts, and I couldn't think straight. But the worst part? The part one couldn't shake? I could feel them getting closer. I have to get out of here. I can't let them catch me. I have to keep moving. Keep running. But how could I run when the forest itself wouldn't let me escape? I pushed forward, my mind a whirlwind of panic, but no matter how fast I walked, how quickly I tried to outrun the feeling, I couldn't shake the sense of being hunted. And that's when I heard it, a low, drawn-out breath, barely audible over the soft rustling of the leaves. Behind me. I spun around, heart leaping in my chest, but the clearing was empty. Nothing but trees, nothing but shadows. The silence pressed in on me once more, heavy and suffocating. Keep moving. I didn't want to turn around again, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't make the fear go away. It was too much. It was everywhere. Every noise, every shadow, every flicker of movement felt like it was closing in, tightening around me like a noose. The forest was alive with it. I took a step forward, my feet heavy, my body trembling. My eyes darted between the trees, my ears straining for any sound, any sign that I wasn't just imagining it. But there was nothing. Only the oppressive stillness. The kind that feels like you're being watched by 1,000 eyes. It's all in your head. Just keep moving. But I knew that wasn't true. I could feel them. They were out there. The shadow, the whispers, the eyes, they were all watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. One mistake, and it'll be over. I gripped my jacket tighter, clutching the fabric like a lifeline, but it didn't help. My heart raced, my breath shallow, and yet every step forward felt like a step deeper into the nightmare. I tried to focus on anything else, my surroundings, my breathing, my legs, anything, but it was all futile. The fear had its claws in me now. I was trapped in this forest, in this endless maze of trees that refused to let me go. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet shifted. My foot landed wrong, and I twisted my ankle with a sharp crack. Pain shot up my leg, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't give in. I had to keep going. I stumbled, leaning against a nearby tree for support, breathing heavily, the pain blurring my thoughts. My mind raced. The shadow was close now. I could feel it. It was drawing nearer, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The fear, the utter terror, was taking over. And then I heard it. Clear and sharp. Footsteps. Not mine. The ground trembled with each step, a heavy, measured pace that echoed in my chest like a drumbeat. I didn't need to look. I didn't want to look. It's too late. I forced myself to move, even as my legs screamed in protest, each step harder than the last. But there was nowhere to run. The footsteps were closer now. I could hear them breathing, slow, deep, deliberate, a heavy exhalation like the wind through dead branches. I could almost feel its presence behind me, close enough to reach out and touch me. I looked ahead, but the trees closed in around me again, as if the forest itself was closing ranks, trapping me. My breath hitched. I wasn't going to make it out. This place, this forest, it wasn't just a forest. It was a living thing, and I was its prey. A noise from behind, then something scraping against the trees, moving faster now. I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't stay. I didn't even look back as I ran. I just ran. I couldn't keep up the pace. My legs were giving out beneath me, and my breath came in ragged gasps. The forest around me seemed to close in tighter, and the shadows stretched longer with each passing second, becoming darker and more oppressive. I stumbled, my ankle throbbing with every step, but the pain was nothing compared to the terror that clawed at my chest. I should have stopped, tried to rest, but I couldn't. I was being hunted. The footsteps behind me, those heavy, deliberate steps, hadn't stopped, hadn't slowed. They were still there, getting closer, following me with relentless precision, like they had all the time in the world. And it wasn't just the footsteps. The air was thick with something else now, whispers. Faint, at first, like the wind through dry leaves, but then louder, more distinct. Don't stop. Run. I was running, wasn't I? Why did it feel like I wasn't moving at all? The trees around me felt like they were closing in, bending in on themselves as if they were trying to keep me in place. The ground was uneven, soft in some places and hard in others, like the forest floor was shifting beneath me, trying to trick me into falling. I looked down, hoping to steady myself, but the earth, the ground, it looked wrong. Like it wasn't really there. Like it was an illusion, a trick the forest was playing on my mind. Keep moving. But I couldn't. The whispers had grown louder, too loud now, and my head was swimming. They weren't just in my ears anymore. They were inside my skull, scratching at the inside of my skull, twisting my thoughts into something I couldn't control. They were everywhere. No matter where I turned, no matter how fast I tried to outrun them, they followed, relentless. I reached for my head, trying to push the noise away, but it only got worse. The voices were in my mind now, whispering things I couldn't understand, words in a language I didn't know, but they felt wrong. It wasn't just words. It was like the forest was speaking through me, controlling my thoughts, feeding me things that made no sense. The whispers were like a haze that clouded my vision, distorted the edges of my thoughts. You're lost. You'll never leave. We are watching. I tried to scream, to force the words out, but no sound came. My mouth was dry, my throat tight. The forest pressed in on me from all sides, smothering me with its cold grip. I could barely see. The trees swirled in my vision, the shadows dancing in and out of focus like something alive. I shook my head, trying to clear it. I had to think. I had to focus. But then, something moved. Not just in the corner of my eye, but in front of me. I froze, my heart pounding, but when I looked, there was nothing there. But there was. I knew it. Something was watching me, something was standing just out of sight, moving in and out of the shadows. The branches moved unnaturally, twisting and turning as though they were alive. I could hear the leaves crunching beneath the weight of something walking behind me, but when I turned again, nothing. It was all in my mind, right? Just the fear. Just the hallucinations. I took a shaky breath and tried to steady myself, but then, right in front of me, something changed. The air thickened. The light dimmed. And the trees, they were different. The trunks were wider now, gnarled and twisted, their bark rough like old, decayed skin. The shadows beneath them seemed to stretch unnaturally, curling around the roots, dark and impossible. I'm losing it, I thought. It's just my mind. Just the fear. I tried to force my legs to move, to keep walking, but my feet felt heavy, like I was dragging them through mud. Each step felt longer than the last, each breath harder to take. Then I heard it. A voice. Clear. Distinct. You can't run from us. I froze. It wasn't the whispers. This was a voice, a real voice. but it didn't sound human. It wasn't anything I recognized. The voice was distant, cold, like it came from the depths of the forest, from somewhere far beyond the trees. It spoke again, slow and deliberate. "You belong here now. Forever." I whirled around, frantic, searching for the source, but there was no one there. No one but the shadows. And the trees. And the whispering voices, still crawling in the back of my mind. I could feel them. All of them. They were everywhere. The ground beneath me seemed to tremble. I could feel something crawling through the earth, shifting the very soil beneath my feet. The trees, they were moving, weren't they? I blinked, and for a moment it felt like the trunks were swaying, bending toward me, as if they were alive, reaching for me with twisted limbs. I took another step, my mind a blur of panic and fear. And then, as if the very earth itself was conspiring against me, the ground gave way beneath my feet. I tumbled forward, falling to the soft earth below. My hands scrambled for purchase, but there was nothing to hold on to. The trees around me seemed to bend and sway, reaching down like the claws of something monstrous. I could feel the weight of them, the darkness pressing in on me, suffocating me. I gasped, scrambling to my feet, but the world around me was spinning, distorting. The forest wasn't just closing in, it was warping, twisting, alive. The trees weren't just trees anymore. They were faces. Dark, twisted faces in the bark, watching me, their eyes gleaming with malice. I tried to scream, but no sound came. I could barely breathe. The air was thick, the weight of it pressing against my chest, suffocating me. I couldn't escape. I couldn't think straight anymore. It was all too much. The forest had me, and I was losing myself. I don't know how long I had been walking. Time had stopped making sense the moment the forest began to change. Hours? Days? It felt as if I had been lost in this place for an eternity, each step forward dragging me deeper into something I couldn't explain. The trees seemed to shift while I wasn't looking, the shadows stretched impossibly long, and the air was thick with an oppressive silence. I had to find something, anything, that could explain what was happening to me. That's why I saw it, a clearing. Barely visible through the thicket of trees, it seemed like a haven, a small escape from the suffocating pressure of the forest. I stumbled toward it, my legs heavy, my mind on the verge of unraveling. I didn't care anymore if it was a trap. I just needed to be somewhere else, anywhere but the ever-closing darkness of the woods. The moment I stepped into the clearing, the air shifted. It wasn't just the sudden change in light. No, it was something deeper, something wrong. The silence here was even more profound, like the entire forest was holding its breath. And then I saw them. Figures. Standing in the center of the clearing, unmoving, like statues. At first, I thought they were just travelers, perhaps other lost hikers. But something was off, something I couldn't quite place. There was no sound, no movement, not even the rustling of leaves beneath their feet. As I drew closer, I realized they were not alive. The figures were ghostly, pale as death, their features frozen in expressions of sheer horror. Their eyes were wide open, unblinking, fixed on some distant horror I couldn't see. Their faces were twisted with terror, their mouths frozen in screams that would never escape. I took another step forward, my heart pounding in my chest. I felt the weight of their eyes on me, even though they didn't move. There were 5 of them, scattered in various poses, some crouched low, others standing, hands raised in some desperate plea for help or defense, but all of them still. And then, I saw the strangest thing of all. Around their feet, on the ground, were remnants of belongings, backpacks, water bottles, torn maps, all strewn about as if dropped in haste. The forest had claimed them, their possessions now fading into the earth like forgotten memories. This can't be real, I thought. They're not real. But as I stared at them, something deep inside me felt a connection, a recognition. I wasn't looking at ghosts, I was looking at victims. Victims of something far worse than I had yet realized. A cold, creeping dread began to fill me. My feet were frozen to the ground, as if the forest itself was holding me in place, forcing me to witness this nightmare. The more I looked at them, the more I could see the subtle details, the tattered clothes, the dirt and leaves in their hair, the remnants of life on their skin. These weren't just phantoms, they were people who had been here before me, lost to the forest in some unexplainable way. Suddenly, I heard it again, the whispering. But this time, it wasn't just in my mind. It came from the figures themselves. The sound was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, more insistent. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear, warning. My breath hitched in my chest as one of the figures, a woman with dark hair matted against her face, slowly turned her head toward me. Her eyes locked with mine, empty, hollow eyes that had seen something no living soul should ever witness. She didn't speak, but her gaze was enough. It was a look of recognition. A look that said, "You're one of us now." I stumbled backward, my heart racing. The air around me seemed to freeze. The clearing, once a beacon of possible escape, now felt like a tomb, the walls of the forest closing in, trapping me in the company of these lost souls. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet refused to obey. "You can't escape," the whispers grew louder, swirling around me, filling my ears, my mind, until they were the only sound I could hear. My mind reeled. I had to get away. I couldn't be here. I couldn't end up like them, like the others who had been lost to this cursed place. I turned and bolted from the clearing, not daring to look back. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how many trees I passed, the whispers followed, wrapping around me like chains. And all I could hear, echoing in the depths of my mind, was the chilling realization. They were waiting for me. They were always waiting. And now, I was one of them. I didn't stop running. I couldn't. The whispers, now a constant, maddening presence in my mind, pushed me forward. The air grew colder the farther I ran, the trees more oppressive, like they were closing in, suffocating me with their dark embrace. I barely registered the world around me, my eyes fixed on the ground, my breath ragged and shallow. But then I saw it. A small, weathered cabin hidden beneath a tangle of vines and thorns. I hadn't noticed it before, and yet something in my mind told me it was there for a reason. Maybe it was the desperation that led me to it, or the feeling that the forest was getting too thick, too impossible to navigate. But it was there, standing silent and forgotten among the trees. A piece of something ancient, something that didn't belong. I stumbled toward it, my heart hammering in my chest, praying for some kind of shelter from whatever was following me. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound too loud in the heavy silence that hung in the air. Inside, the space was dim, cluttered with old, broken furniture and shelves full of dusty jars and books. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, maybe decades. But something caught my eye. On the floor, half hidden beneath a pile of old newspapers, was a leather-bound journal. The cover was worn and faded, the edges frayed from years of neglect, but it had the unmistakable feel of something that belonged, something that had been waiting for me. I didn't know why, but I knew I had to read it. I had to understand what was happening to me. I knelt down, my hands trembling as I picked it up. The pages inside were yellowed, brittle with age, but the writing was still legible, the ink dark against the old paper. I flipped through the pages, my eyes skimming the frantic scrawl of someone desperate to get a message out before it was too late. And then I found it. A cryptic entry, the words jagged and scratched out as if the writer had been too frantic, too terrified to write anything neatly. The words jumped out at me, each one making my heart skip a beat. The forest, it doesn't want us to leave. The spirits of the settlers, ancient souls lost to this land, are trapped here, and they hunger for more. They take those who wander too far, twisting their souls into something else. They want us to join them, to become part of their endless existence. There is no escape. The forest watches. The shadows watch. And we are already lost. I felt my breath catch in my throat. The words sank in slowly, painfully, like a chill creeping through my bones. The ghosts. The whispers. The strange figures I had seen, frozen in terror, they were like me now. Trapped. Cursed. Part of something ancient and dark that had never been meant to end. The journal went on, detailing the experiences of the writer, how they had wandered into the forest, had heard the whispers, seen the shadows, just as I had. They had thought they could escape, but each time they tried, the trees had moved, the paths had shifted, and they had been pulled deeper into the web of the forest's curse. The writer's final words were the most chilling of all. If you find this, if you're reading this now, you're already part of it. The forest has claimed you. You will never leave. You will join us. I dropped the journal in a daze, my hands shaking violently. The truth, this horrifying, impossible truth, was sinking in. The figures, the whispers, the feeling of being watched, everything was connected. It wasn't just some strange phenomena or coincidence. This place, this forest, it was alive. It was hungry. It had been feeding on the souls of those who had come before me, twisting them into something unrecognizable, something that would never be free. And now, it was my turn. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew it was true. The ghosts I had seen, the terrified faces of past hikers, were not just manifestations of the forest's madness. They were the forest's prisoners. They were like the woman in the clearing, their souls bound to this place, cursed to roam the woods for eternity, their bodies nothing but empty shells, waiting for the next soul to join them. I wanted to scream, to run, but the whispers had already found me, growing louder, more insistent. I felt them tugging at my mind, pulling me back toward the heart of the forest, back toward the shadows where they waited. It's too late to run. You belong here now. The air was suffocating, thick with the weight of the forest's power, and for the first time, I understood. I had been brought here not by chance, but by something darker, something older. And now, the forest had me. There was no way out. No way but to join them. I could hear them again. The whispers. At first, they had been faint, a distant hum, like a breeze shifting through the trees. But now they were inside me. Their words twisted and warped, slithering into the crevices of my thoughts, replacing my own memories with images of the forest, of the lost souls that wandered its endless expanse. You're one of us now. You can't escape. Join us. Forever. The lines between the world I knew and the nightmare I was trapped in had begun to blur. The air around me felt thick, like it was pressing down on my chest, suffocating me. The trees seemed to close in, their trunks warping and shifting with every blink. I couldn't tell if I was walking forward or circling in the same spot. My legs were heavy, and my breath came in shallow, panicked gasps. It was as if the forest itself had grown aware of me, of my fear, and it was using it to pull me deeper into its grip. The ground beneath my feet shifted, the path disappearing only to reappear in a new direction, teasing me, trapping me. Every step I took seemed to lead me further away from reality, from the world I once knew. The forest was alive, and it was watching me, waiting for me to break. I stopped, my mind racing. The cabin I had found earlier, the one that had given me a glimmer of hope, was gone. In its place was nothing but a dense thicket of vines, wrapping around the trees like tendrils, closing off any possible way out. My heart pounded in my chest. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Am I even awake? I staggered backward, my hands pressed against my temples as if I could somehow block out the cacophony of voices screaming in my head. But they were relentless. They echoed in my ears, louder and louder, until my vision blurred and the world around me began to collapse in on itself. The forest had become an extension of my mind, twisted, disjointed, and warped. I looked around and saw the faces of the lost hikers, their ghostly forms staring at me with wide, empty eyes. They weren't just standing there anymore, they were moving, shifting through the trees. No, they were me. I watched in a daze as their bodies contorted and morphed, their faces stretching into monstrous versions of my own. I heard their voices calling to me, but it wasn't their voices, it was mine. My voice, distorted, stretching across time. You're one of us now. Join us. The forest never lets go. The ground beneath my feet shifted again, and I stumbled, nearly falling into a deep hole that had appeared out of nowhere. The trees twisted above me, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, clawing at the sky. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure. It was standing between the trees, pale, translucent, with eyes that stared straight through me. It was her, the woman from the clearing. Her face was no longer twisted in terror, it was blank, hollow. The expressionless face of someone who had forgotten what it was like to be alive. She reached out toward me, her hand trembling, beckoning me forward. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Instead, the forest itself seemed to answer her call. The trees groaned, the air thick with the scent of decay and damp earth. I didn't know why, but my feet moved before my mind could stop them. I had to go to her. I had to join them. There was nothing left for me in the world outside the forest. This is where I belong. My vision began to swim. The whispers were everywhere now, drowning me, suffocating me with their endless chants. I stumbled forward, my mind unraveling, every step dragging me deeper into the dark embrace of the woods. And then, just as I reached the woman's outstretched hand, I felt it. The world stopped. The whispers fell silent. For a brief moment, everything went still. The forest froze, the shadows paused, and the pressure on my chest released. It was as if I had crossed into a new reality, a place where time no longer mattered, where the living and the dead blurred together into one endless, suffocating existence. I felt her hand, cold but familiar, touch mine. This is it, I thought. This is where I end and where I begin. And as I looked into her hollow eyes, I realized something. I had never truly been alone. The forest had always been waiting for me. It had been calling me, waiting for me to join its eternal hunt, waiting for me to belong. I closed my eyes. The darkness was overwhelming. But in that moment, I didn't fight it. I let go. And then, nothing. The moment I let go, the forest reacted. It wasn't just the trees that closed in around me now, but everything. The air grew thick, the ground soft and treacherous beneath my feet, each step a struggle, as though the earth itself was pulling me back. I gasped for breath, my heart thudding violently in my chest, panic taking root deep within me. I didn't care anymore. I had to escape. I had to leave this place, this nightmare that had already claimed so many souls before me. With a cry of desperation, I turned and ran, not bothering to look back, not caring where I was going. I just needed to get away. The whispers were still there, but now they were frantic, shrill, as if the forest itself was urging me to stay, warning me that escape was impossible. But I didn't listen. I ran faster, my legs pumping, breath ragged, pushing myself harder, hoping against hope that somehow I could outrun the curse of this cursed place. I was getting farther away from the clearing, from the ghosts of the lost hikers, and the suffocating presence that had followed me so relentlessly. The trees, however, seemed to mock my efforts. Every time I turned, every time I thought I was heading in the right direction, I found myself back where I had started. The same twisted trunks, the same gnarled branches reaching down like skeletal hands, blocking the way. It didn't make sense. I tried to tell myself I was just disoriented, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming now. I could feel the trees themselves shifting around me, the shadows stretching longer, as if the forest was alive and aware of my every move. I stumbled into another clearing, but it wasn't one I recognized. There was something wrong with it, something off. The air was colder here, heavier. The grass was covered in a strange frost, the ground brittle and cracked, as though it hadn't seen warmth in decades. And then I saw it. A figure stood at the far edge of the clearing, framed by the dark silhouettes of the trees. Its form was familiar, but it was wrong, too tall, too thin. It was one of them. One of the ghosts. I couldn't tell if it was a memory, a hallucination, or something worse. Its eyes glowed in the dim light, hollow and endless, and it was staring directly at me. I froze. My heart pounded, and my breath caught in my throat. I was so close now. Too close. "You can't run," it whispered. Its voice was the same as the others, a disembodied murmur that seemed to come from all directions. "You belong here. You are one of us now." I turned, heart racing, and bolted in the opposite direction, my feet pounding the frozen earth as I pushed through the dense underbrush. The air grew heavier with each step, as though the forest itself was resisting me, pulling me deeper into its labyrinthine hold. The trees twisted overhead, and the sky above darkened, thick clouds swallowing the last remnants of daylight. I ran until my legs burned, until my vision blurred with exhaustion. I couldn't stop. I had to keep going. The sounds behind me, footsteps, whispers, followed me, echoing through the trees, always right behind me. Every now and then, I would hear the faint sound of something scraping against bark, something moving just out of sight. I didn't dare to look. But no matter how far I ran, no matter how hard I pushed myself, the forest kept shifting. The trees would rearrange themselves, closing off any path that I thought led to freedom. The more I struggled, the more lost I became. The woods were like a maze, ever-changing and cruel, each direction just leading me further into its depths. This place doesn't let you leave. It was as though the forest had become part of me, entwining itself with my very thoughts, my fears. The shadows had multiplied, stretching in unnatural ways, flickering just beyond my vision, like creatures waiting to pounce. I couldn't tell what was real anymore. What was a trick of my mind and what was a product of the forest's curse? I thought of the ghostly figures I had seen earlier, their eyes hollow with terror. They had been me once. Just like them, I had been lured into this trap, fooled by the false tranquility of the trees, the promises of adventure. And now, I was part of the forest too. And yet, I refused to believe it. I couldn't. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way to escape this nightmare, to get back to the world I had known before it was too late. But every path I took grew darker. Every breath grew more labored. The forest itself seemed to laugh at my attempts to escape. I pushed myself harder. I ran until my body gave out, collapsing onto the frozen earth. My limbs felt numb, my head spinning with exhaustion. I could feel the forest closing in on me, its suffocating grip tightening around my chest. And then I heard it again. The voice. The whisper. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was many. Thousands, all speaking in unison, repeating the same words over and over until they filled my mind, until they drowned out all other thoughts. You cannot leave. I squeezed my eyes shut, desperately trying to block out the words, trying to block out the growing terror that had taken root in my chest. But it was too late. The shadows were all around me now, crawling along the ground, reaching out for me with their cold, invisible hands. I tried to scream, but no sound came. I was paralyzed, trapped in a nightmare that was closing in around me, tightening like a noose. And then, just as I thought I might lose my mind completely, I saw something. In the distance, through the trees, a faint light flickered, real light, not the sickly glow of the shadows, but something warm. Something familiar. Without thinking, I scrambled to my feet, stumbling toward the light, my heart pounding with desperate hope. Maybe, just maybe, I had found the edge of the forest. The way out. The escape that had been promised to me. But as I reached the light, it faded, and all I could see was darkness. I couldn't remember how long I had been running. Hours? Days? Time had become irrelevant in the forest, swallowed whole by the labyrinth of trees and shadows. My legs burned, my head spun, but I couldn't stop. Every breath was a desperate gasp, every movement a fight against the creeping cold that pressed in on me from every direction. Then, through the fog of panic and disorientation, I saw it. A cabin. Its silhouette appeared between the trees, a faint outline against the thickening darkness. My heart jumped in my chest, and for a moment, hope flickered. Perhaps this was what I needed, shelter, a place to rest, to regain my bearings. A chance to break free from the forest's relentless hold. I stumbled toward it, my footsteps uneven as I pushed through the underbrush. The cabin stood alone, half hidden by the towering trees that encircled it, their branches like skeletal arms reaching toward the sky. The building looked old, too old. The wood was weathered and gray, the roof sagging in places as if time itself had decided to leave it behind. The windows were boarded up, but the front door was slightly ajar, creaking with every gust of wind that slipped through the trees. I hesitated. Something about the place felt wrong. The air around it was still, unnaturally so, as if even the forest feared to disturb the cabin. But I couldn't afford to be cautious. Not anymore. I pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest as I stepped inside. The cabin's interior was dark, save for the dim light of the moon filtering through cracks in the walls and ceiling. Dust hung in the air like a fog, settling over everything with the weight of neglect. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I took a cautious step forward, my pulse quickening. There were signs that someone had lived here once, rusted tools scattered across the floor, a half-empty bottle of something that had long since turned foul, and a fireplace that had long been abandoned. But there was something else, something that made the back of my neck prickle with unease. The air was colder here, and the silence was thick, oppressive. As I moved deeper into the cabin, my eyes were drawn to the walls. Old photographs, some faded with age, were pinned up on the cracked wooden beams. I stepped closer to one, my breath catching in my throat as I looked at the faces frozen in time. They were familiar, these faces, too familiar. The faces of the missing hikers. The photographs showed them in various stages of their journey, smiling, laughing, posing for the camera in front of the very same trees I had passed through. There was a man, his arm around a woman, their faces bright with life. Another photo showed a small group standing by a campfire, their eyes wide with excitement, not knowing what would come. But the last photograph, the last one, sent a chill crawling down my spine. It was a close-up of a woman, her eyes wide, her expression frozen in terror. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, but there was something else. Something beyond the terror, something darker. A shadow. A shadow that loomed behind her, its form indistinct, like a rip in reality itself, its presence unnatural. I pulled away, my breath coming too fast now, panic rising in my chest. I turned toward the far corner of the cabin, where a door led to what looked like a small bedroom. The floorboards creaked beneath me as I approached, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I had to get out of here, but my feet refused to move. It was as if the cabin had claimed me, just as the forest had. The walls seemed to close in, the space growing smaller, more oppressive. And then I heard it, a soft whisper, almost too faint to hear, but unmistakable. You shouldn't have come. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The voice was faint, but it was there. A whisper, low and haunting, curling around my mind like a tendril of smoke. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was still, empty save for the remnants of the past. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow, shifting in the corner of the room. It moved, slipping through the cracks in the walls like liquid darkness. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes, it was gone. But I could still feel it, its presence lingering, pressing down on me, watching. I backed away from the corner, my mind spinning. The whispers grew louder, clearer now, coming from all directions. They were all here. They had all been here. The spirits of the lost hikers, trapped, just like me. I turned to leave, but as I stepped toward the door, something stopped me. A sudden, unnatural cold flooded the room, and I heard it again. You shouldn't have come. I turned, my heart in my throat, and saw her. The woman from the photograph, the one whose face had been frozen in terror. She stood at the far end of the room, her eyes wide, her mouth open in a scream that was soundless. Her face was pale, her skin stretched tight over her bones, her clothes tattered and covered in dirt. But it wasn't just her. There were others. Figures, emerging from the shadows, their faces gaunt and hollow, their eyes dark voids. They moved toward me, their bodies flickering in and out of existence, their footsteps silent on the cabin floor. The cabin had become a tomb, a place where time had stopped, where the dead lingered, trapped between worlds. I tried to move, to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot. I could hear their whispers now, clearer than ever, and I could feel their cold presence seeping into my skin, my bones. Join us. Forever. I turned toward the door, but it slammed shut in front of me, the impact shaking the walls. The figures were closer now, their hollow eyes fixed on me, their forms shifting and distorting, becoming more twisted with each passing second. I was trapped. There was nowhere to go. Join us. I backed into the corner of the cabin, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The walls closed in on me, and the whispers filled my mind, drowning out everything else. Join us. The darkness was overwhelming now, closing in from all sides. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was her face, the woman from the photograph, staring at me with empty eyes. And I realized then, the spirits weren't just following me. They were waiting for me. I had become one of them. The forest was alive in a way that made my skin crawl, in a way that nothing I had ever known could prepare me for. The trees creaked and groaned as though they were breathing, exhaling deep, ancient sighs into the air around me. I could hear their whispers now, not just the ghosts, but the trees themselves, their bark scraping together like dry bones. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the very forest had become one with the spirits that haunted it, and I was trapped within it. I couldn't outrun it. No matter how fast I ran, no matter how deep I pushed into the woods, the forest followed. It wasn't just the wind or the rustling of leaves anymore, something else was moving, something far more sinister. The trees shifted, twisting and creaking, as if they were deliberately rearranging themselves to prevent me from finding my way. Each turn I made, each path I thought would lead me to freedom, only led deeper into the maze of dark, oppressive woods. I turned sharply, thinking I had found a break in the trees, a gap between them that would lead me to the open air, but the moment I looked up, I froze. The trees were closer. They had moved. It wasn't just my eyes playing tricks. The trunks, which had once seemed far apart, were now leaning toward each other, their branches interlocking like fingers in a grip, forming an impenetrable wall. I stumbled back, my pulse racing as the ground beneath me seemed to shift, the once familiar trail gone, replaced by a web of twisted roots and gnarled branches. I backed away, panic clawing at my chest, but the forest wasn't done yet. No. It was only just beginning. A figure appeared at the edge of my vision, one of the shadowy figures I had seen before, but this time it was closer. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. The form was translucent, shifting like smoke, its hollow eyes locked onto mine. The shadows around it seemed to bend toward it, as if obeying its will. I turned to run, but it was everywhere now. The shadows. They stretched unnaturally, elongating, curling around trees and rocks like tendrils, trapping me in their grip. No matter where I turned, the darkness closed in tighter. My feet were caught in the roots, tripping me, pulling me down as I scrambled to get up. A loud snap echoed behind me, and I whipped around, eyes wide with terror, heart pounding in my throat. The shadow was there again, much closer, its form now distinctly humanoid, its eyes wide and empty, staring into my soul. It didn't move with the fluidity I had seen before. Now it stalked, deliberate and slow, drawing nearer with every second, its footsteps silent but sure. The trees moved again, their branches swaying in ways that felt wrong, too deliberate, too alive. I could hear the creaking of the bark, a low groan of the forest as it bent and twisted to form an inescapable trap. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, making the leaves whirl around me in spirals of terror. I stumbled forward, my breath ragged, legs threatening to give way beneath me, but no matter where I turned, the forest seemed to be closing in, funneling me toward the shadow. Its hollow eyes were fixed on me now, its face contorting in a grotesque imitation of a grin, the darkness around it swirling like a vortex. It spoke, but there was no sound. Its mouth moved, its lips curling into a silent hiss, and I felt the words, felt them, as though they were being whispered directly into my mind. "You can't escape." The trees groaned again, and I screamed, bolting in the opposite direction. The forest seemed to respond. Every step I took forward felt like a step backward, the path shifting under my feet as if the earth itself was trying to swallow me whole. I ran faster, but the shadow followed, its form flickering in and out of existence, appearing in front of me with every turn, every twist. The wind howled again, louder now, and the trees bent with the force of it, their branches reaching for me like claws, pulling me toward them. The shadows stretched again, wrapping around me, suffocating me in their grip. I could feel the cold, the unnatural chill creeping up my spine, crawling into my bones as the shadows tightened their hold. Every step I took seemed to push me deeper into the forest, into the darkness that I couldn't escape. It was as if the woods itself was alive, an organism of pure malevolence, trapping me in its grip, feeding on my fear. The trees closed in once more, and I could no longer tell which direction I was running in. Everything had become indistinguishable, trees, shadows, figures, all blending together in a chaotic mass of horror. The ground beneath me seemed to pulse, like the beating heart of the forest, and with every beat, the shadows grew stronger, the trees more twisted. And then, in the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, standing perfectly still in the distance. Pale, gaunt, its eyes empty and staring. The same woman from the photograph. But she wasn't smiling anymore. She was crying. The tears streaked down her face, black as pitch, and the sorrow in her expression twisted my insides. Her mouth moved, but no sound escaped. "It's too late." I tried to turn and run, but the shadows reached for me, pulling me back. I screamed, but it was drowned out by the wind, by the eerie whispers that filled my ears. The forest had me now. There was no escape. It wasn't just chasing me. It was feeding on me. And I knew, deep down, that I would never leave. Not alive. Not whole. I had become part of the forest. A whisper filled the air around me, faint but unmistakable. "Join us." The air had grown thick with an unnatural stillness, the kind of silence that presses down on your chest, makes it harder to breathe. The wind had stopped, leaving only the soft rustling of leaves that felt more like whispers now, scratching against the ground like fingernails on glass. I stood frozen, staring into the darkness. The figure was there again, its presence unmistakable, though it was not quite visible in the way I'd expect. It seemed to blend with the very shadows that twisted around me, its form more like a distortion in the air itself. I could feel its eyes on me, even though it had no face to speak of. The eyes, those hollow, empty sockets, gleaming with something ancient, something that felt as old as the forest itself. And then it spoke. No voice. No sound at all. Just a sensation, a pressure that pushed into my skull, as if the words were being carved into my brain. "You have two choices." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, filling my head, the words a low, guttural hum. My pulse quickened, the blood rushing in my ears. My legs wanted to give out, but I couldn't look away, couldn't move. The air grew colder, the shadows closing in tighter, and yet, something about this voice felt familiar. Like a memory, or perhaps a warning I had heard before, somewhere deep within my own mind. Join the forest, or be forgotten, lost. The figure swayed slightly, its form rippling like a mirage. It was as though the forest itself was alive, its breath mingling with mine, its very essence pressing in from all sides. The pressure in my chest grew unbearable, and I felt my thoughts faltering. The path ahead was closed off by endless rows of twisted trees, their branches clawing at the sky like desperate hands. I glanced behind me and saw nothing but darkness, a void that seemed to consume the very air. "Join us," it repeated, the voice wrapping itself around my mind like a vine, tightening. "Surrender to the forest, become one of us, and you will never be alone again. Or wander forever in the darkness, searching for a way out that will never come." My heart raced. I could feel the coldness creeping into my bones, as though the forest itself was turning me to ice. The figure in the shadows was waiting, still, silent, watching. The choice was being forced upon me, a decision that would determine my fate: surrender to this ancient, living nightmare, or fade into the endless void of lost souls that roamed these cursed woods. "There is no escape," the voice whispered one final time, its tone laced with finality. "You will either join the forest, or become one of the lost. The choice is yours, but time is running out." I swallowed hard, a bitter taste in my mouth. My legs felt like stone, my mind a swirl of panic and fear. I didn't want to join them, didn't want to be another shadow in this endless, cursed night. But the forest was closing in, its grip tightening around my chest. It was too much to fight, too much to understand. But there was a part of me, deep inside, that refused. I had to find a way out, any way out, no matter what the voice said. But before I could take another step, something shifted. Something deep within the earth itself seemed to tremble. And then I heard it. A sound, faint but unmistakable. "Run." It wasn't the voice from the shadows. It wasn't the forest or the spirits. It was something else. Something real. The final warning had been given. Now, it was time to run, whether I had a chance to escape or not. I turned and bolted into the darkness, the whispers of the forest howling in my ears as I plunged deeper into the heart of the nightmare, knowing that the true test was only just beginning. I ran, but the ground beneath me felt unstable, shifting with every step, as if the earth itself was conspiring against me. The trees loomed like giants, their branches reaching down to snag my clothes, pulling at my limbs, as if the forest were alive, unwilling to let me escape. My breath came in ragged gasps, each inhale sharp with fear, each exhale a desperate plea to the unknown. But no matter how fast I ran, the shadows were always just a breath behind me, their cold, hollow whispers clawing at the edges of my sanity. The air grew thicker, more suffocating, as if I were drowning in it. The trees closed in around me like a cage, narrowing the path until there was nowhere left to go. My heart pounded in my chest, echoing through the silent forest like a death knell. Then, I felt it. At first, it was a slight pressure, like a brush against my shoulder, so faint that I almost convinced myself it was just my imagination. But the pressure grew, soft, unseen hands gripping at my arms, my legs tugging at me from all directions. I spun around, but saw nothing. The darkness was suffocating, the trees blocking out any hint of moonlight. It was as though I had stepped into a different world, one where the laws of nature no longer applied. I tried to break free, pulling against the unseen force that held me. But the hands tightened, their grip iron-like, unyielding. The air was thick with dread, the very atmosphere saturated with the oppressive presence of something ancient, something hungry. The shadows around me seemed to move, twisting, shifting like smoke, and then I saw them. Figures, standing motionless at the edges of my vision, their forms barely visible in the inky darkness. They were close now. Too close. I tried to scream, but my throat was dry, the sound strangled, as if the very air was choking me. The figures moved toward me slowly, gliding across the ground like specters, their faces twisted in eternal terror, their eyes wide and hollow. They were no longer human, not in any real sense. Their features were distorted, their mouths open in silent screams, their hands reaching toward me with a desperate hunger. I stumbled backward, trying to get away, but the hands kept coming, tugging at me, pulling me toward the waiting figures. The forest was no longer just a place, it was a prison, a trap, its walls closing in with each passing moment. The trees, the shadows, the figures, they were all part of it, part of the curse that had taken hold of this place. The figures began to encircle me, their movements jerky, unnatural, as though they were struggling against some unseen force. They were trapped here, just like me, their souls bound to this cursed land, forever frozen in a state of terror. I could feel their presence, their endless despair pressing in on me, suffocating me, as though their fear was contagious. One of them reached out, its hand cold and clammy, its fingers curling around my wrist with a force that sent a shock of ice through my veins. Its face, if you could even call it a face, was a grotesque mask of fear and suffering. Its mouth opened wide, and for the first time, I heard a sound, a low, guttural growl, as if the thing was trying to speak. "Join us." The words were not spoken aloud, but I felt them in my mind, a sharp, biting whisper that echoed in the depths of my skull. It wasn't a request, it was an order. A demand. I fought against the grip, but it was useless. The unseen hands were everywhere now, their cold fingers pressing into my skin, digging deep, pulling me toward the figures who waited, their eyes gleaming with something ancient and knowing. I felt my body going limp, my strength draining away, as though the forest itself were feeding on me, pulling me into its cursed heart. The dread thickened, turning to panic, and I realized with a sudden, horrifying clarity what the figures were. They were the lost, those who had come before me, trapped in the same nightmare, their souls forever bound to the forest. And now, I was about to join them. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, as the figures drew closer, their faces twisting in agony. Their hands reached for me, their touch ice cold, sending waves of terror through my body. I tried to break free, tried to scream, but the hands wouldn't let me go. The shadows closed in tighter, suffocating me in their cold embrace. And then, I understood. The forest wasn't just a place, it was a prison, a living entity that consumed everything that wandered too deep. And the figures? They were the proof, the warning for anyone foolish enough to step into this hell. I was going to join them. The world around me darkened further, the whispers growing louder until they drowned out everything else. There was no escape. There was no hope. I felt my legs give way, my body collapsing into the cold embrace of the forest, and the last thing I heard before everything went black was the voice, soft and relentless. "Join us." The darkness pressed against me, a weight that bore down on my chest with an oppressive force. I could feel the coldness seeping into my bones, crawling beneath my skin like a slow poison. The world around me was a blur of twisted shapes and flickering shadows, but everything felt distant, as though I was sinking deeper into some forgotten abyss. The figures, the lost ones, had surrounded me, their hollow eyes fixed upon me, watching as I trembled in their midst. I could no longer move. My body felt foreign, heavy, as though it no longer belonged to me. Every instinct screamed to me to fight, to run, but the will to resist had long since drained from me. The forest had consumed every shred of strength, every spark of hope, leaving only an empty shell. I felt the numbness spreading from my limbs, wrapping around my heart, my soul. The forest, the whispers, the figures, they were no longer just a threat. They were an inevitability. The truth had settled in. There was no escape. No way out of this nightmare. The trees had closed in, trapping me like a fly in a web spun by some ancient creature. I had wandered too deep into its heart, and now I would never leave. Join us. The voice came again, not from one of the figures, but from the very air itself, as if the forest was speaking through the shadows. The words slid into my mind, insistent, relentless. There was no need for force anymore, no need for the cold hands that had held me tight moments before. I was already one of them. I could feel it now, the change, the transformation. I had fought it. I had tried to deny it. But the forest had worn me down, and now I knew what awaited me. There was no escape. I would join the others, the lost souls who wandered these woods for eternity, cursed to haunt the earth as shadows, trapped between the living and the dead. I had thought that there was some fight left in me, some small spark that would keep me alive, keep me human. But that was before I understood what the forest wanted. What it was. It wasn't just a place, it was a living thing, a beast with a hunger that could never be satisfied, a hunger that fed on fear, on despair, on souls like mine. The forest had a way of twisting time, of warping reality until nothing felt real anymore. I had no sense of how long I'd been here. Hours? Days? Weeks? The concept of time had become meaningless, as if the forest itself had swallowed it whole. All that remained was the dread, the crushing weight of the dark, the endless blackness that threatened to consume everything in its path. My body trembled, not from the cold, but from the deep, suffocating terror that gnawed at my mind. The forest had claimed me, and I could feel its essence seeping into me, twisting my thoughts, warping my perceptions. My memories, my old life, seemed to dissolve into nothing, like vapor in the wind. They no longer mattered. Nothing mattered. I tried to cling to the fragments of who I was, who I had been. I tried to hold on to my name, my past, but they slipped through my fingers like sand. The figures around me were silent now, no longer speaking, but I could feel them. They were waiting, just as I had once waited for something that would never come. I looked at the faces of the lost souls. They were as I had seen them before, twisted, broken, their eyes wide with terror, their faces frozen in eternal anguish. They were no longer human, not really. They were part of the forest now, part of the cursed land that had claimed them. And soon, I would be just like them, another shadow in the darkness, another soul to wander the woods forever. There was no mercy in this place. No escape. The forest had won. I closed my eyes, feeling the pressure around me grow. It wasn't physical, it was something else, something far worse. The forest was pressing in on my soul, suffocating it. And slowly, I began to understand. This wasn't just a forest. It was a prison. A prison for the lost, for the damned. And I was about to join them. A faint memory flickered in my mind, a whisper of something that felt like a lifetime ago. A warning, perhaps. A story I'd once heard about the haunted woods of Washington State, about the hikers who vanished, never to be seen again. But it was too late now. Those stories were nothing more than forgotten echoes. I had walked too far, gone too deep. And now the forest would claim me. The forest would claim us all. And as I stood there, feeling my consciousness slip further away, I finally accepted it. There would be no escape. The only thing left was to surrender to the darkness, to the forest, to the endless shadows that waited to swallow me whole. The forest had won. The air grew colder still, and the silence was no longer peaceful. It was suffocating, pressing down on me like a physical weight. My limbs were numb, my thoughts sluggish, as though I were drifting in and out of some twisted dream. The shadows around me, those twisted faces, those hollow-eyed figures, seemed to pulse with an ancient energy. The whispers, once faint, had grown into a low, constant murmur, filling the space like an endless chant. It was a language I couldn't understand, but I felt it in my bones, in the marrow of my soul. It was ancient, old as the trees, as the earth itself. The ground beneath me trembled. It was subtle at first, a slight vibration, but it grew stronger, shaking the very foundation of the forest. The trees groaned as though in pain, their bark shifting and cracking, their roots writhing beneath the soil. The forest was awakening, its hunger, its thirst for souls, was stirring. And I knew, with a sickening certainty, that it was beginning. The figures that surrounded me, the lost souls, began to move. They didn't walk or shuffle, they glided, their forms flickering and shifting, their limbs never fully touching the ground. It was as though they were part of the air, part of the darkness that had consumed this place. Their eyes, once empty, now gleamed with an eerie, spectral light, their faces twisted in expressions of both anguish and anticipation. They were preparing for something. They had been waiting for me. The one closest to me, its face a grotesque mask of fear, its mouth open as though trying to scream, reached out. I could see its hand, transparent and flickering, as it hovered just in front of my face. It wasn't real, not in any physical sense, but it was real in a way that cut through the fabric of the world I had known. I could feel its touch, icy cold, like death itself. A whisper brushed my ear, a voice that sounded like it came from the very earth beneath me. "You will join us." The words weren't spoken. They were felt, absorbed, as though they were part of the forest itself. They wrapped around my mind, squeezing tight, suffocating any remnants of resistance. The fear that had consumed me earlier now gave way to something worse, something darker. A sense of inevitability. A sense of powerlessness. And then, the ritual began. The forest trembled again, and this time it wasn't just the ground. The trees groaned, their branches twisting and stretching unnaturally, as if reaching towards some unseen force. The shadows of the lost souls grew longer, twisting and elongating as they began to form a circle around me. They weren't moving, at least, not in any way I could understand. It was as though they were frozen in time, waiting for something. And then, in the center of the circle, something appeared. It was a figure, tall, towering, and indistinct, its edges flickering like a flame, but its presence was undeniable. It wasn't human, not in the way I understood it. It was something older, something more primal, a being that existed beyond the constraints of flesh and bone. It was the forest itself, or at least its embodiment. The forest was alive, a sentient, malevolent entity that consumed those who wandered too deep into its embrace. The figure's presence felt like a black hole, pulling at everything around it, absorbing light, sound, and life itself. It didn't move, yet I could feel its gaze. It was looking at me, and the weight of its attention was unbearable. My body trembled, my mind screamed, but I couldn't move. I couldn't escape. The spirits began to chant. Their voices, hollow and distant, echoed in my mind, in the very air around me. The words were alien, unintelligible, but the power behind them was unmistakable. The very forest seemed to pulse with each word, each syllable. The trees trembled, the ground cracked, and the air turned thick, as though it were being compressed by some invisible force. The figure in the center raised its hand. A cold, agonizing chill swept through the air, freezing the blood in my veins. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt the pressure around me intensify. I could hear the whispers more clearly now, each one calling my name, urging me forward, pulling me deeper into the ritual. I tried to resist, tried to fight it, but it was as though the forest itself had a hold on my very soul. You belong here now. You will never leave. The words echoed in my mind, louder now, more insistent. The ground beneath me shook violently, and I could feel something pulling at me, dragging me toward the center of the circle. I fought, but my limbs wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed, trapped in this unholy ritual. The figure raised its hand again, and a surge of energy shot through the air. It was cold, sharp, like a blade of ice slicing through my very soul. I felt it then, something inside me. Something that had once been alive, something that had once been human, begin to fracture. It wasn't just my body that was being consumed. It was my very essence, my spirit, my soul. The forest was claiming me. It was feeding on my fear, my despair, my surrender. I could feel my identity slipping away, my thoughts dissolving into the cold, unfeeling darkness. The whispers became louder, more insistent, until they drowned out all other sound, until they filled every corner of my mind. Join us. Forever. The words, no longer a whisper, but a command, echoed through me, vibrating in every fiber of my being. And as the last shred of my resistance crumbled, I felt it, a cold, inescapable pull, as though the very fabric of my existence was being unraveled, thread by thread. I had lost. The forest had won. And as my consciousness faded, as I sank deeper into the darkness, I understood the truth. The ritual wasn't just for me. It was for all the lost souls that had come before me, and for all those who would come after. We were the forest's prisoners now. Forever. I could feel it, the last remnants of myself slipping away. My thoughts, once sharp and clear, now felt as though they were being submerged in a thick, murky fog. The forest had its grip on me now, and every breath I took felt colder, heavier, as if the air itself were thick with the weight of 1,000 lost souls. But something deep within me refused to let go. The part of me that had once been human, the part of me that had fought to survive, the part that hadn't yet succumbed to the darkness, this part fought back. My body trembled, my mind screamed, but I couldn't let it take me. I couldn't let it win. No, I won't be a part of this. The words echoed in my mind, a final cry for freedom. I forced my legs to move, despite the numbing cold and the suffocating weight of the forest. My muscles screamed in protest, but I pushed forward, stumbling, tripping, trying to break free from the suffocating grip of the trees. But every step felt like wading through a nightmare. The shadows reached for me, pulling at my limbs, as though they were trying to drag me back into the circle. The air around me thickened, the darkness closing in, and the whispers, those endless, mocking whispers, grew louder, more urgent. They were everywhere, in my ears, in my mind, in my very soul. You cannot escape. You are ours. I fought it. I fought them. My heart raced, my blood pulsed in my ears, my breath came in ragged gasps. I reached for the air, reaching for something, anything, just to feel something real again, just to feel like I wasn't slipping into the void. I wanted to scream, but the words stuck in my throat, caught in the web of terror that had spun around me. But then, for the briefest of moments, a flicker of clarity returned. A memory, sharp and fleeting, flashed before my eyes. The sound of running water. The trailhead. The sun breaking through the trees. The world beyond this nightmare. I'm still here. I'm not gone yet. With that thought, I stumbled forward, pushing through the suffocating darkness, using everything I had left. My body screamed, my mind screamed, but I wasn't going to let it end here. Not like this. I felt the ground shift beneath my feet, roots grabbing, pulling. The trees groaned, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, as though the forest itself were fighting against me. I tripped, falling to the ground, but I refused to stop. I pushed myself back up, forcing my legs to move. But it was no use. The forest was too powerful. I felt a cold hand press against my chest, icy fingers wrapping around my heart, squeezing tighter and tighter, like a vice. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Every ounce of strength, every last desperate attempt, seemed to be draining from me, as though the forest was absorbing it all, feeding on my struggle. The darkness was closing in, suffocating me, overwhelming me. And then I saw it, the figure in the center of the circle, towering over me, its eyes glowing with an eerie, soulless light. It moved towards me, its form flickering like a flame in the wind, its shape indistinct, but its presence undeniable. It was the forest's true face, the embodiment of its hunger, of its endless thirst for souls. You cannot fight us. The voice was a whisper, but it was everywhere, inside my head, inside my chest, inside my soul. It was suffocating. I could feel my body weakening, my thoughts dissolving. I was slipping into the darkness. Join us and become one with the forest. The words resonated deep within me, but I resisted. I fought. With the last shred of all I had left, I pressed forward, my vision blurring, my heart pounding. I could feel the weight of the spirits closing in on me, their cold, hollow eyes burning into me, their voices rising in a deafening chorus. But I couldn't stop. Not now. I refused to stop. And then, in a final act of defiance, I cried out. I didn't know if it was a prayer, a scream, or just a desperate howl into the void. But in that moment, I gathered every ounce of resistance I had left and pushed forward. With a sudden surge of adrenaline, I broke through the circle, forcing my way through the figures that surrounded me, through the shadows that reached for me. For one brief, fleeting moment, I felt the pressure loosen. The air cleared, the whispers died down, and the weight on my chest lifted. The forest, the ancient, malevolent force that had tried to claim me, seemed to recoil, as though confused by my resistance. I took a breath, a real breath, as though I had emerged from underwater. But it was too late. The trees around me trembled, their branches creaking with an ancient fury. The ground shook beneath me. I felt the presence of the forest closing in once again, suffocating me, crushing me. And then, as the darkness overwhelmed me, I knew there was no escaping it. Not now. Not ever. The forest had won. I was lost, forever bound to its cursed grip. The darkness wrapped around me like a cold, suffocating shroud. My body no longer felt my own. The air was thick, damp with the scent of decay, and the ground beneath me had ceased to be solid. I couldn't tell where I was, or even what I was anymore. The world around me had become a blur, colors, shapes, sounds, all blending together into an incomprehensible void. I had no idea how long I'd been here, in this in-between place, this twisted part of the forest where time seemed irrelevant. Had it been hours? Days? Or perhaps it had been mere moments since I lost all sense of time. I tried to move, tried to make sense of the emptiness that stretched on, endless and hollow. But my legs felt like they were rooted to the spot, unable to lift or bend. Every movement, every thought, was sluggish, distant. I could no longer tell if the sensation in my limbs was the faintest echo of pain or simply another part of this nightmare. The whispers returned. Not in the distance this time. No, they were inside my head, swirling through my thoughts like tendrils of smoke. Names, faces, words, memories. At first, I tried to hold on to them, fighting to remember who I was. My name, where I came from, the people I had loved, the life I had lived. But they slipped away from me like water through my fingers. I could feel the memories fading, disintegrating, as though they were being erased from my mind, one by one. Who was I? I reached for the fragments of myself, but they shattered the moment I touched them. It was as if the forest itself was stripping away everything that made me human, pulling me deeper into its tangled, eternal grip. You are one of us now, the voice whispered. It was familiar, and yet so distant. It echoed not just in my head, but in the very air around me, vibrating in the space between the trees. The forest claims all who enter, and now you are ours. I opened my mouth to protest, to scream, but no sound came. There was nothing left to say. There was nothing left to hold on to. The faces of the lost began to appear around me, spectral figures, hollow-eyed and gaunt, their features frozen in expressions of terror. They reached out, their hands passing through me, their touch cold, like a gust of wind from the grave. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. I was no longer sure if I even wanted to move. I could feel the memories slipping away, the weight of my past, my identity, gone, scattered to the wind like dead leaves. There was no sense of time, no sense of self, no sense of anything but the oppressive presence of the forest around me. You are one of us now. You are home. I no longer knew whether those words were meant to comfort me or condemn me. Was there a difference? The ghostly figures, the once living souls who had wandered too far into the woods, now moved together in a solemn, wordless procession. I watched them, but even their faces felt distant, as though they, too, were losing themselves. Slowly, they were becoming part of the forest, becoming indistinguishable from the shadows, from the trees, from the very air itself. I felt myself being drawn into their ranks, my thoughts growing hazy and distant. Your name is gone. Your life is gone. You are here now. The words filled me, saturated me, until there was nothing left of me but the cold, dark silence of the forest. My face, once my own, felt strange now, as if it belonged to someone else. The person I had been, the person who had hiked into these woods, full of life and curiosity, was no more. I was nothing. A shadow. A whisper in the wind. I had become just another part of the forest's eternal army. You are home now. The last flicker of resistance in me was snuffed out as I felt myself fade completely, becoming one with the trees, with the shadows. A part of the forest's ancient, unyielding hunger. I had become nothing more than a presence, an essence, a whisper within the trees. My form had dissolved, merging with the cold, unyielding wood. I no longer had a body to move, to feel. My thoughts, once frantic and full of terror, now swirled aimlessly like the wind through the leaves. Time had no meaning anymore. Days, years, centuries could pass, and I would never know. All that existed was the forest, its ancient hunger, its endless whispers. I had become part of the forest, as if my very soul had been absorbed into the vast, cursed expanse. The trees had eyes, eyes that were not mine but belonged to the spirits that had come before me. I could see through them now. I could feel their every movement, hear the faint cries of the lost souls within their trunks. The forest stretched endlessly, a maze of towering trees, thick underbrush, and tangled roots. The sounds of the forest were all around me, rustling leaves, creaking branches, and whispers that curled through the air like smoke. But there was no escape. There was no escape for me, or for those who would come after. The forest had claimed me, and now I was its prisoner, its sentinel. And then I saw them. A group of hikers, just as I had once been, wide-eyed, excited, oblivious to the danger that loomed before them. They laughed, they chatted, they marveled at the beauty of the forest, completely unaware of the fate that awaited them. They were drawn in, just as I had been. The forest called to them, its dark tendrils stretching out to pull them closer, to trap them, just as it had trapped me. I watched them from the shadows, my presence unseen, my soul bound to the forest's pulse. They had no idea they were already walking through the threshold into the realm where the living could not survive. They were already lost, and they didn't even know it. I felt the pull, that same deep, aching hunger that had overtaken me when I first entered. The forest craved their fear, their confusion, and soon it would have them as it had had me. They didn't know it yet, but their lives would soon be consumed, their identities erased, their spirits bound to the trees. One of them, a woman, maybe in her late 20s, paused and glanced around, as though sensing something. Her eyes darted nervously between the trees, her hand instinctively reaching for her phone, but no signal. She couldn't feel the presence I did. She couldn't hear the whispers that beckoned her closer. The group continued forward, unaware of the unseen force that was already at work. The air around them shifted, darkening, growing still. A faint rustling echoed from the woods, and the woman stiffened. She looked behind her, but there was nothing. Just the forest. I could feel it. I could feel the same tightening in my chest, the same chill that had gripped me when I first realized what was happening. I could feel her fear, her uncertainty. The forest was pulling at her, inviting her in, drawing her closer. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, though they were muffled in the distance. Come closer, come, find your place among us. The voices were not my own. They were the voices of the lost, the ones who had come before, the ones who had failed to resist. They were now part of the forest, trapped within its endless reaches, bound by the curse that had claimed them. They called to the new victims, urging them to take the final step into the abyss. I watched them, the group of hikers now approaching a clearing just up ahead. The sunlight barely penetrated the thick canopy above, and a strange fog had begun to creep in, swirling around their feet like the breath of the dead. I could feel their unease. They had begun to realize, even if only on a subconscious level, that something was wrong. But it was too late. It was always too late. The leader of the group, a man with a strong, confident air, seemed oblivious, waving off the others' concerns with a laugh, claiming it was just the weather. But I saw it. I saw the way his eyes lingered on the shadowy forms moving between the trees, the flicker of doubt in his expression. He, too, was starting to sense it. The darkness closing in. The feeling of being watched. But it would do him no good. I knew what would happen next. The trees would close in on them. The forest would shift, bend, and twist, just as it had done for me. The path they had once walked would vanish, and they would be swallowed whole. The figures they had begun to glimpse out of the corners of their eyes would come into full view, shadowy, translucent forms that whispered their names, their memories, their very essence, calling them into the forest's fold. One by one, they would lose themselves, just as I had. Their fear would become part of the forest's power, feeding the ancient curse that bound us all. And in time, they too would fade into the darkness, becoming nothing more than memories in the trees, lost souls who could never escape. I had become a part of the forest now. Its pulse was mine, its breath was mine, and I could feel the souls of the lost swirling around me, fading into the endless shadows. The cycle would continue. It always did. And when the next group arrived, I would watch them just as I had watched the others, helpless to stop the forest's hunger. And so, the forest stretched on, endless, eternal, claiming every soul that dared to enter as it had claimed mine. The shadows deepened. The whispers called. And I was there, part of it all. Forever. The sun had just begun to rise, casting long, golden rays through the trees, dappling the forest floor with light. The air was crisp, fresh, a welcome contrast to the stifling darkness that lingered beneath the canopy. It was a perfect morning for a hike, or so he thought. His name was Thomas, a young man in his early 30s, eager for a solitary escape into the wilderness. He had read about the beauty of Washington's national parks, the serenity of its vast forests, and the challenge of its rugged trails. A weekend getaway was all he needed to clear his head, to escape the chaos of his busy life. His steps were light as he set off along the familiar path, the one that had once welcomed me with open arms. I watched him from the shadows, unseen, but fully aware. He was like me, an innocent soul, unaware of the dangers that waited, ignorant to the fate that lay ahead. Thomas paused at the trailhead, taking a deep breath and gazing at the towering trees that loomed above. He checked his backpack one last time, making sure he had everything: water, snacks, a map. He smiled, excited to begin his journey into the depths of the forest. As he walked deeper into the woods, the familiar sounds of nature surrounded him: birds calling, leaves rustling, the distant sound of a brook. Everything seemed calm, peaceful, as if the forest itself was inviting him in. And in a way, it was. The forest was always welcoming to newcomers, offering its beauty and tranquility as a lure to those who didn't know what lay hidden beneath its canopy. I had been where Thomas was, standing at the edge of the unknown, full of hope and anticipation. But I had learned the truth too late, and I could already feel the same pull beginning to take hold of him. With each step he took, the forest seemed to grow denser, darker. The path ahead twisted and turned, disappearing behind thick clusters of trees. But Thomas paid no mind. He was in the moment, caught up in the beauty around him, the stillness that was only broken by his own footsteps. I could feel him, his presence so fresh, so alive, a stark contrast to the soulless husks of those who had come before him. His energy was vibrant, full of life, and it made the forest stir. He was too far in now to turn back. I had seen this before. Seen countless others make the same mistakes. The forest didn't let you leave once you had entered its grasp. And Thomas, like the rest, would soon realize that the path he was walking wasn't a trail to adventure, but a road to oblivion. As he reached a small clearing, a strange feeling seemed to wash over him. The air grew heavier, charged with something he couldn't quite place. He shook it off, attributing it to the morning mist, or maybe the isolation that came with being deep in the wilderness. But the feeling remained, persistent and unnerving, as though the very trees around him were watching, waiting. The whispers, faint but unmistakable, began to stir in the corners of his mind like the rustling of leaves in the wind. At first, he thought it was the forest itself, a trick of the breeze, maybe, but then the whispers grew clearer, more distinct. His eyes flickered around the trees, heart beginning to race. But there was nothing. Just the woods. Just the endless forest. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, to dismiss the unease creeping up his spine. He pressed forward, further into the wilderness, unaware that the very ground he walked upon had already been claimed. I could see it all. Every step he took, every breath he drew, every moment of hesitation. He was walking the same path I had once walked, and soon he would come to know the truth. Just as I had. The forest had many faces, many voices, and it was always watching, waiting for its next victim. The twisted spirits that now roamed the woods would soon catch his scent, just as they had caught mine. They would begin to circle, inch closer with each passing moment. I could feel the first signs of it now. The air seemed to shift around him, pressing in on him from all sides, like the forest itself was closing the distance. He stopped for a moment to check his map, unsure of which direction to take. But the map would be no help. The forest didn't work with maps. It worked on instincts, on fear. The path, once clear, now seemed to vanish into the trees, swallowed whole by the dense undergrowth. The whispers grew louder. A branch cracked in the distance, though there was no breeze. And still, he moved forward. I watched, helpless to stop what was already in motion. The forest had chosen him, and there was no escape now. His footsteps faltered as he glanced around, the sense of being watched growing stronger. He turned back, but the path he had come down was no longer visible. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, blocking his way. He was lost. The air thickened, cold and oppressive. His breath came faster now, panic creeping into his chest. But it was too late. The whispers had already taken hold. The forest had already begun to claim him, to weave him into its endless web. I could see the shift in his eyes, the dawning realization that something was terribly wrong. But that realization would come too late, just as it had for me. The forest didn't let go. And as I watched him, my thoughts no longer my own, I could only wonder, would he be another soul to join us, another lost wanderer trapped in the endless maze of trees? Or would he, too, fade like the others, disappearing into the dark embrace of the forest, becoming nothing more than a memory in the shadows? I was both witness and prisoner now, bound to watch as the cycle began anew, knowing that no one would ever leave the forest once it had set its sights on them. And soon, Thomas would understand. Just as I had. Thomas trudged deeper into the forest, the sense of unease tightening around him like a physical weight. The forest had an oppressive quality now, the towering trees blocking out much of the morning light, casting everything in an eerie twilight. He was aware of the creeping silence, no birds, no rustling of leaves, just the echo of his own movements, amplifying in the stillness. As he walked, he kept expecting to see signs of other hikers, small markers on the trail, signs of life, familiar remnants of human presence. But as the minutes passed, something strange began to nag at him. He should have come across more, something, anything, by now. There had been no hikers in sight when he first started, but that wasn't entirely unusual for early morning. What felt strange, though, was the absence of the little markers of human life that typically dotted the path, wrappers, empty water bottles, the occasional discarded jacket, or a broken branch from someone pushing through. Nothing. His thoughts turned back to the trail guide he had read before setting out, a well-trodden path, popular with weekend hikers. He should have seen signs of activity by now. But there was nothing. Only the eerie quiet. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and he grew restless, the isolation beginning to settle in. He pressed on, telling himself it was nothing, just his mind playing tricks on him. That was until he reached the point where the path veered sharply to the left, where he had been told to expect a small campsite area. At first, he thought he had found it, an old tent, half collapsed, with a sleeping bag spilling out from under a pile of scattered gear. But as he approached, something didn't sit right. The tent was completely empty, no sign of life, no belongings, nothing to suggest the hiker had just stepped away for a moment. His footsteps faltered as he leaned closer, the realization creeping in. The sleeping bag, still rolled up and neatly tied, had not been used for days, if not longer. And the nearby backpack, which had clearly been abandoned in a hurry, was oddly devoid of the usual things you'd expect: a water bottle, food wrappers, something personal. There were no signs of struggle, no indication that the hiker had left in a rush, yet the eerie stillness of the abandoned campsite hinted at something more unsettling. It felt wrong. Too wrong. Thomas's hand hovered near the tent, but he pulled it back, unease filling his chest. He took a deep breath and turned away, telling himself it was just an abandoned camp, someone had left, and he would leave it at that. But as he did, something tugged at him, a whisper that seemed to come from the wind, or maybe just his overactive imagination. "You're not alone." The hairs on his neck prickled. He glanced around. Nothing. Just the trees. But there was a presence now, as though the forest had eyes that followed him. He shook off the feeling, trying to focus on the path ahead, but something caught his eye, a small, frayed piece of rope, barely visible against the undergrowth. It was tied to the base of a tree, but the rope, it had been cut recently. It wasn't a part of the tent, nor a part of anything he'd seen so far. Confused, he knelt down to inspect it. The cut was sharp, clean, as though someone had deliberately severed the rope with precision. But why? "Maybe it's nothing," he whispered to himself, though even as the words left his mouth, he wasn't sure if he believed them. He stood up, wiped his hands on his pants, and forced himself to keep moving forward, ignoring the mounting feeling that something, someone, had been here far too recently. A few more steps, and he was back on the main trail, but again, the uneasy silence remained. Where were the other hikers? As he moved deeper into the woods, he started to notice more and more signs of abandonment, things that should have been there, but were missing. A broken flashlight left on the ground, its lens cracked. A pair of boots, half buried in the dirt, abandoned in haste. It wasn't just the absence of people, but the eerie signs of things being left behind, as though their owners had simply vanished, without a trace. It was becoming harder to ignore the creeping dread now. Every scrap of evidence felt wrong. These weren't the marks of casual hikers. These were the remnants of people who had disappeared, their presence erased in a way that seemed deliberate. A sense of dread began to settle heavily on his chest as he moved further away from the abandoned campsite. The absence of signs, no trails, no markers, no human presence, was too much for him to ignore now. The forest, which had once seemed welcoming and beautiful, now felt oppressive, as though it were slowly swallowing him whole. Where was everyone? Why had he seen no one on the trail, no other hikers? A rustling noise behind him made him freeze. He whipped around, but there was nothing there, only trees. But the sound lingered in his ears, a whispering crackle, faint but unmistakable. His heart raced. Slowly, he began to walk again, faster this time, but the sense of being followed never left. Each step seemed to echo too loudly in the silence of the woods. "It's just my nerves," he muttered, but the words did little to calm him. Then he heard it again. The unmistakable sound of a twig snapping, sharp and close. He froze. Slowly, he turned. But there, just beyond the trees, there was nothing. The forest had already begun to shift around him. The signs of previous hikers were gone, replaced by the unsettling reminder that those who had come before him had disappeared without a trace. They had left nothing behind, no trail, no mark. And as he stood there, he began to realize, with a sickening certainty, that he would be the next to vanish, another lost soul claimed by the forest. And the worst part? No one would ever know he was there. The woods would swallow him whole, just as it had done to countless others, leaving behind only the faintest traces of his existence. Thomas had been walking for what felt like hours, but the unsettling sense of being watched hadn't left him. The forest seemed to close in with every step, and the air grew heavier, colder, as if the very woods were holding their breath. He had no idea why, but a nagging pull in his gut urged him to stop for a moment. He fumbled for his camera, a habit he'd formed since beginning the hike. It was an old model, the kind you might find in a thrift store, nothing fancy, but reliable. He snapped a photo of the forest around him, capturing the tangled mess of trees and the soft sunlight filtering through the leaves. A small moment of calm before he continued. He raised the camera again, aiming it towards the distant tree line, feeling a strange compulsion to take one more shot. The shadows between the trunks seemed darker now, even though the sun was still high in the sky. He squinted at the viewfinder, adjusting the focus. It was then that something caught his eye, something unnatural. Just beyond the trees, in the thick shadows, a figure moved. He snapped the photo quickly, barely thinking about it, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood straight up as soon as he lowered the camera. There, between the trees, stood a figure, too tall, too thin, its outline faint but unmistakable. It was almost translucent, its features obscured by the shadows, but the feeling it radiated was all too familiar. The figure stood motionless, watching him. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't imagined it. The thing was real. He felt the pull of fear settle into his bones as he stared at the spot where it had stood. But it was gone now, as if it had never been there at all. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves, but the oppressive silence that had lingered before returned, more suffocating than ever. His hands trembled as he looked down at the camera. He had taken the photo, just like before, and now he had the proof. He snapped the viewfinder up to his face once more and clicked the playback button. The screen flickered to life, showing the image. And there it was, standing between the trees, its dark, hollow eyes staring directly at him. The figure was unmistakable, even more defined now in the small screen's glow. Its form was ghostly, shifting, as though it existed in multiple planes of reality at once. The figure was the same one he had seen in the woods earlier, and now it was in his photo. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead as his heart hammered in his chest. His breath was shallow, rapid. He'd been in the forest for hours, but it felt as though time itself was warping, stretching, as though he'd stepped into a nightmare that would never end. The figure had followed him, and now it had made its presence known in a way he couldn't deny. Suddenly, the camera slipped from his fingers, and he stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a rock. He didn't care. He had to get out of here, away from whatever was watching him, wherever it was. His legs felt like they were made of lead as he turned, intending to leave the trail behind and run back the way he had come, but when he looked again, the woods seemed different. The trees were closer now, almost like they were bending inward, pressing on him. The wind shifted. He could have sworn he heard something, whispers, distant and unintelligible. His name? Was it his name? No, it was just the wind. Just his mind playing tricks on him. But the whispering grew louder, more distinct. He looked down at the camera, lying abandoned on the forest floor. He should leave it behind, but an inexplicable pull dragged him back toward it. He knelt down to pick it up, his hands still shaking, and quickly shoved it into his backpack. Then, with his heart in his throat, he began to move faster, pushing through the underbrush, fighting the rising panic that had begun to overtake him. He couldn't escape the feeling that the forest had turned against him, that it had always been this way, waiting for the next hiker, the next soul to take. In the distance, a twig snapped. He froze. And from the trees, the shadows seemed to stretch toward him, bending unnaturally, as though they were reaching for him. The figure was still out there. He couldn't run forever. The forest had already claimed so many. And soon, he would be another face in the shadows, another figure waiting to be caught on film by the next unsuspecting hiker. Thomas's breath came in short, panicked gasps as he pushed through the thick underbrush. His heart pounded against his ribs, his legs moving on instinct rather than thought. Every time he thought he might have gotten further away from the presence that pursued him, the woods seemed to pull him back, the path twisting and turning in impossible directions. His mind screamed for escape, but the forest felt like it was closing in on him, forcing him deeper, as if it had always been waiting for him to arrive. The whispering grew louder, more urgent. Now, it was impossible to ignore. The voices, soft and sibilant at first, now seemed to swirl around him, growing in volume with every step he took. His name echoed in his ears, faint and distant, like a warning from a place he could no longer escape. But it wasn't just his name, there were other voices, too. Soft cries, fragments of words, fragments of souls lost to this place. It didn't matter how far he ran. The forest was a maze, and it had no exit. Then, as if the trees themselves parted to reveal the truth, Thomas saw it, a figure standing just beyond the clearing, its shape indistinct, flickering like a shadow caught between worlds. He froze, his feet unable to move, his mind unable to process the reality of what stood before him. He had seen this figure before, in the photograph, in the moments before the darkness overtook him. It was there again, standing just out of reach, its dark eyes watching him with a hunger that transcended mere death. He should have turned and fled, but his legs wouldn't respond. His mind was fogged with the same inexplicable pull that had ensnared him from the start. The whispers escalated into a chorus, the voices now seeming to emanate from every corner of the forest. They were not just disembodied voices, they were alive, they were real, they were memories of the forest itself. The past. The future. A presence that refused to let anyone leave. Thomas took a step forward, compelled by something he couldn't resist. It wasn't fear anymore, it was something deeper, something darker. The forest had already begun to claim him. His hands reached out involuntarily, his fingers brushing against the cold bark of a nearby tree. A strange feeling surged through him, like electricity, but it wasn't from the tree, it was from within the forest itself. It coursed through his veins, filling him with a cold emptiness. The trees seemed to whisper his name once more, and in that moment, he realized it wasn't the forest that called, it was the spirits. The same spirits that had claimed so many before him, the lost hikers, the forgotten souls. They were waiting for him, just as they waited for everyone who wandered too deep into the heart of the forest. And Thomas understood then, in a cruel flash of clarity, that he wasn't meant to leave. He never would. In the distance, the sun began to dip beneath the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The figures in the trees seemed to grow taller, more solid, their forms shifting as they emerged from the darkness, their hollow eyes locked onto him. The forest had him now. It always had. With no way out, Thomas felt his mind begin to unravel. His thoughts were no longer his own, replaced by the whispered voices of the lost, urging him to join them, to surrender to the forest's eternal hunger. It was too late to fight. And as he took another step forward, feeling the earth beneath his feet shift and grow cold, Thomas realized that the cycle, the nightmare, would continue. The next hiker, the next soul, would find their way here, just as he had. They would hear the same whispers, feel the same chilling presence. And the forest would call them in. The cycle had begun again. Thomas no longer felt the weight of his own body. No heartbeat. No breath. No pain. The cold had long since settled in, an eternal chill that clung to his very being. He stood, if standing was even what it could be called, on the edge of the forest, watching, waiting, forever trapped within the labyrinth of trees that had claimed him. He no longer had the ability to move, to scream, or to even feel the weight of his own existence. He was just there, suspended in an endless, unyielding moment, surrounded by the spirits of the lost. He could see them all, those who had come before him. Their faces, frozen in terror and regret, were twisted into expressions of silent horror. Their bodies, translucent and half-formed, flickered between the trees, moving aimlessly, eternally trapped in the cycle. They were the forest now, and they had no escape. And yet, it wasn't the silence that haunted him most. It was the whispers, the constant, unrelenting whispers. The voices of the lost, murmuring in his ear, sharing their eternal sorrow. They had all been here, once, living, breathing people who had walked the same path he had. Now, they were part of something far darker than the living could ever understand. They were part of the forest. They were the forest. Thomas wanted to scream, wanted to warn the next hiker. But he could only watch, as helpless as the others. The cycle was inevitable, and it always began the same way. A new presence appeared on the edge of the woods. A figure, bright and unaware, stepped lightly onto the trail, the new hiker, eager and unafraid, the same way Thomas had been. His movements were filled with excitement, with a kind of naivety that Thomas could never get back. The young man looked around, taking in the beauty of the forest, unaware that the beauty was an illusion, one that masked the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface. The shadows shifted. They were already reaching for him, stretching out from between the trees, eager to claim yet another soul. Thomas watched, his invisible form trembling with the desire to warn him, but no words would come. There was nothing left to say. The newcomer paused, looking around. His eyes scanned the trees, the underbrush, the thick shadows pooling at the base of the trunks. His expression shifted slightly, a flicker of unease crossing his face. But then he smiled, as if reassuring himself that it was just his imagination. But it wasn't. The whispers started, low and soft, like a far-off breeze. The newcomer's eyes darted around, his body stiffening as the air grew colder. But it was too late. The forest had already begun to shift, the trees subtly closing in on him, the path becoming indistinct, unfamiliar. Thomas couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't warn him. He could only watch as the cycle began again, as the shadows crept closer, as the forest slowly started to claim another soul. The newcomer stepped forward, his footsteps hesitant but curious. The shadows stretched out, brushing against his ankles, urging him deeper into the woods. And with each step, the whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices that only the lost could hear. Thomas could feel the pull of the forest now, deep in his essence. It was stronger than ever, like an invisible hand gripping his soul, urging him to give in, to become part of the woods once again. But he could never forget. Not the way he had arrived, not the way the others had arrived. He knew what was coming. The newcomer turned, his face pale, his eyes wide with growing realization. He felt the forest's presence now, felt the oppressive weight of the spirits surrounding him. He began to back away, his breath quickening, but the woods had already started to change. The trees shifted, the shadows twisted, and with one final, terrifying movement, the forest closed in on him. And then, there was nothing. Just the silence of the woods, the whispers of the lost, and the endless cycle of souls. The forest claimed its newest addition, just as it had claimed so many before. Thomas felt a dull, empty pang, a longing, perhaps, or regret. He had lost his chance, his escape. But now, all he could do was watch. Watch as the cycle began again, watch as the shadows reached out for yet another victim. A final, silent scream echoed in his mind, a scream that could never leave his lips. The forest would never stop. The cycle would never end. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.